Hey there, tonight we're uncovering why it sucked to be a medieval carpenter in a world where splinters were the least of your worries. What you're about to discover is a life filled with sawdust, superstition, and surprisingly little glamour. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you thought your 9 to 5 was rough, try being a medieval carpenter. Yeah, you heard that right. Put down your mocha latte, and let's dive into the splinter-filled world of Middle Ages woodworking. You, my friend, are about to become intimately acquainted with the joys of living in a time when being a human hammer and chisel was the height of career aspirations, minus the dental plan, health insurance, or soap. All right, let's start with the ungodly hours. Forget about clocking out at 5 or having weekends off. Your day begins at the crack of dawn, and by that, I mean when the first rooster loses its voice. You get to work with the sun barely peeking over the horizon, and you don't stop until it's slinking back down. That's right, you're looking at a solid 12 to 14 hours of back-breaking labor, 6 days a week. If you're lucky, you might get Sunday off, but only if you've been really good, or if the local lord decides he can worship without adding another tower to his estate that day. Now, don't let the modern-day romanticism of medieval craftsmanship fool you. You're not carving intricate wooden dragons or crafting ornate cathedral ceilings every day. Nope. Most of your time is spent doing the medieval version of construction site grunt work. Think more haul that timber over here, and less design this exquisite piece of furniture. The bulk of your life is about hefting heavy beams, sawing through logs, and banging nails into place, without the help of power tools. It's just you, your hammer, and a prayer that your thumb isn't in the way. Still, you're not just some replaceable cog in the medieval machine. Carpenters were literally the backbone of the construction industry back in the day. Without you, castles wouldn't have roofs, barns wouldn't stand, and bridges would remain someone's bright idea. But here's where the medieval economy really sticks it to you. For all your vital contributions, you're pulling in a measly 2 to 3 pence a day. And yes, that's before taxes, which, by the way, were very much a thing. To put it in perspective, it'd take you about a week to afford a pair of shoes, assuming you didn't spend a single pence on beer or bread in the meantime. And speaking of money, or the lack thereof, let's talk about food. While you might think that a carpenter's diet was filled with hearty medieval feasts, think again. Your meals are pretty much the medieval equivalent of a ramen diet. A lot of bread, some porridge, a kind of thick stew, and if you're lucky, a bit of cheese. Meat is a luxury reserved for Sundays, or when you've somehow managed to save up a little extra. And forget about dessert, unless you count the occasional apple or berry you find on your way home. Now, you might hear tales of grand cathedrals and intricate woodwork, and sure, some carpenters got to flex their artistic muscles now and then. But for the most part, it's all about the grind. The romanticized view of medieval work as a world of artistic fulfillment is just that, a romantic view. Most of the time, it's monotonous, repetitive, and tough on the body. You're more likely to end your day with a splinter the size of a toothpick in your hand than a masterpiece. Let's also not forget the working conditions, health and safety regulations. In your dreams, the only thing protecting you from falling timbers or a misstep on the scaffolding is your own wits and whatever prayers you manage to squeeze in between mouthfuls of bread. And yes, accidents were common. A misplaced foot could mean a broken bone or worse. Doctors, sure, if you count the local barber with his bloodletting skills as a medical professional. But hey, let's give credit where credit's due. You're not just a laborer, you're a skilled artisan when the occasion calls for it. Those grand halls with their intricate woodwork. Somebody's got to know their way around a chisel, and that somebody is you. You're the one turning raw timber into the very structures that define the medieval landscape. It's no small feat, even if you're not getting paid what you're worth. So, next time you're feeling a bit down about your own job, just remember, at least you're not a medieval carpenter. Unless you really like the idea of hard work, low pay, and spending your days covered in sawdust with nothing but a bowl of porridge to look forward to. In which case, hey, maybe you were born in the wrong century. Speaking of hard work, Let's get into the nitty-gritty of what you'd actually be using to toil away your days as a medieval carpenter. First off, the materials. Now, you might think that wood is wood, right? Wrong. In the Middle Ages, not all timber was created equal. Oak was the big boss, the heavyweight champion of the medieval building scene. It was sturdy, durable, and had the kind of longevity that made it the wood of choice for everything from the local lord's manor house to the barn down the road. But getting your hands on quality oak wasn't as simple as taking a stroll to the nearest Home Depot. Oh no, my friend. You'd sometimes have to travel over 50 miles to find a decent stash, and that's not on a cushy road trip with AC and a podcast. Think more along the lines of a sweaty, muddy trek with a cart and a donkey, if you were lucky. And once you found it, you'd better have a good relationship with the landowner, because you weren't just waltzing in and chopping down trees like you owned the place. This was a time when land rights were as rigid as the timber itself. Once you finally got your hands on the oak, you're not exactly spoiled for choice when it comes to tools. Forget about your laser-guided saws and electric drills. The medieval carpenter's toolbox was a rudimentary collection of saws, hammers, and chisels that would make even the most old-school handyman shudder. Your saws were basically glorified serrated knives. The frame saw, for example, was the pinnacle of cutting-edge technology. Pun very much intended. It was essentially a wooden frame with a blade stretched between it, operated by hand. Imagine the Popeye forearms you develop from hours of sawing through dense oak with one of those bad boys. And let's not even talk about nails. These weren't your uniform, machine-produced nails. Each one was hand-forged by a blacksmith, which meant they were as expensive as they were inconsistent. You cherish each one like a precious gem, driving them in with a hammer that was less about precision and more about brute force. It's a wonder anything stood up at all, but hey, that's what happens when necessity is the mother of improvisation. Now you're probably picturing all this and thinking, wow, it must have been a real art form. Well, yes and no. Sure, there was skill involved, plenty of it, but don't romanticize it too much. Most of the time, this was survival work. You weren't aiming to create an architectural digest masterpiece. You were trying to keep the rain out and the walls from caving in. The artistry was a byproduct of necessity, not a deliberate pursuit of beauty. The medieval carpenter was essentially the Swiss Army knife of the construction world, expected to know a little bit about everything. Framing, roofing, joinery, you name it. And while the notion of a master craftsman is appealing, the reality was a lot more grueling. These guys were the unsung heroes of medieval society, toiling away without the fanfare or the pay to match. But let's be real. Despite the hardships, there was something undeniably satisfying about taking a raw material and shaping it into something useful. It's the kind of tactile work that leaves you with a tangible result at the end of the day, even if that result was a splinter-riddled thumb and a back that felt like it was made of lead. And while the tools might have been outdated, the skills required were anything but. You needed an eye for detail, a knack for problem-solving, and the kind of physical endurance that would put modern-day athletes to shame. So next time you're complaining about a dull office job, just remember those medieval carpenters. They were the original DIY enthusiasts, pounding nails and carving out a living one timber beam at a time. It might not have been glamorous, but it was honest work in the truest sense. And if you ever find yourself pining for the past, just ask yourself, do I really want to swap my ergonomic chair for a splintery stool? Because the medieval carpenter didn't have that luxury. They had oak, a trusty saw, and a whole lot of grit. Now, before you toss your ergonomic chair and declare yourself a medieval carpenter, let's talk about the economics of wood back then. Spoiler alert. It's not all about picturesque forests and quaint wooden cottages. Picture this, but in a medieval context. Wood was essentially the oil of the Middle Ages. It was the lifeblood of construction, fuel for fires, and even a form of currency in some regions. In short, wood ruled the roost, and if you were in the business of shaping it, you were smack dab in the middle of an economic juggernaut. First off, let's tackle the logistics of getting your hands on this precious resource. It wasn't just about grabbing an axe and heading to the nearest grove. Oh no, my friend. That would be like trying to mine Bitcoin with a pocket calculator. Let's start with the cost. Transporting timber wasn't just pricey. It was practically a medieval money pit. Imagine this. A single cartload of timber could cost as much as a skilled laborer's monthly wage just to move a few miles. And remember, we're not talking smooth highways here. Think rutted paths, questionable bridges, and the constant threat of bandits who saw your timber as their next payday. Speaking of bandits, road safety wasn't exactly top-notch. It wasn't uncommon for entire shipments to be lost to raiders or simply disappear into the forest, never to be seen again. So, transporting wood was less of a straightforward task and more of a gamble. You were either going to build a breathtaking manor or contribute to the local highwayman's retirement fund. Now, the politics of wood trading were just as twisted as the gnarled branches of an ancient oak. Enter the Magna Carta, that 1215 political blockbuster that everyone's heard of but few really understand. While it's famous for limiting the power of the king and establishing some basic rights, cheers to that, it also had some serious implications for trade and construction. Before the Magna Carta, the monarchy had a stranglehold on resources like forests. The king could declare any tract of land a royal forest, effectively locking it away from common use. But the Magna Carta forced a rethink. It opened up more land for use, which meant more timber for carpenters and builders. Score one for the little guy, right? But even with these newfound freedoms, the reality was still harsh. Just because more land was accessible didn't mean everyone had equal access. Landowners still held all the cards, and you had to negotiate, and sometimes grovel, for the right to fell their trees. This wasn't just a handshake deal. It involved contracts, permissions, and sometimes the greasing of palms. Remember, this was a time when your word was only as good as your ability to back it up with a hefty sum of silver. All these factors created a web of economic dependencies. Carpenters weren't isolated artisans working in forested solitude. Nope, they were part of a sprawling network involving traders, landowners, blacksmiths, and more. Imagine a medieval linked in where every connection was crucial for survival. You needed to know a good blacksmith for those hand-forged nails, a reliable trader for tools, and perhaps a shady character or two who could expedite your timber transport. The myth that medieval life was isolated is just that, a myth. Carpenters were as connected as any modern-day freelancer hustling for gigs. And let's not forget the role of guilds, those medieval unions that were part trade organization and part social club. Being in a guild was like having a golden ticket. They set the standards, protected your rights, and even provided some rudimentary insurance against injury or poor craftsmanship claims. Want to know how much you should charge for a new roof? The guild had your back. Need to settle a dispute over who barched the Lord's banquet hall? The guild was your mediator. These organizations were the backbone of trade, ensuring that carpenters weren't just at the mercy of landowners and lords. So, while the romantic image of a solitary carpenter toiling in a woodland idyll is appealing, the truth was far more complex. Every beam, every plank, every nail was part of an intricate dance involving economics, politics, and social networks. The medieval carpenter was a key player in a broader economic system that stretched across kingdoms. They were both the artist and the entrepreneur, the craftsman and the businessman. And as you can see, their work was anything but isolated. It was interconnected, interdependent, and essential to the fabric of medieval society. In short, if you thought carpentry was just about wood, think again. It was about navigating a labyrinth of economic and social hurdles, all while trying to carve out a living, literally and figuratively. So, next time you hear someone wax poetic about the simplicity of medieval life, just remember that behind every carved beam was a carpenter juggling more than just his chisel. They were the unsung heroes of an age that was anything but simple. So, let's dive into the social strata of our medieval carpenters. Forget the image of the noble artisan, plying his trade under the approving gaze of a grateful lord. The reality was far less glamorous, and a lot more about juggling precarious survival with a dash of artistry. Carpenters were essential yet undervalued, a paradox wrapped in sawdust and sweat. In the grand hierarchy of medieval society, carpenters occupied a space that was neither high nor particularly respected. Sure, their skills were indispensable for constructing everything from humble hovels to grand fortresses, but this didn't translate into power or privilege. Imagine being the one holding the architectural future of a castle fortification in your hands and still being just a whisker above the peasantry in social standing. It's like being the IT guy at a tech company. Everyone needs you, but no one's putting your name on the marquee. Now, Why were these skilled workers often overlooked? The answer lies in the medieval economy's twisted logic. Carpenters were seen as mere laborers, their artistry overshadowed by the sheer necessity of their work. You see, the Middle Ages were less about celebrating the craftsman and more about getting the job done. No one was commissioning a carpenter to build a cathedral for the sheer beauty of it. It was about keeping the rain out and the enemies at bay. Even while toiling on something as impressive as a castle, your daily bread came from the same hard-won pence as when you were fixing the local tavern's leaky roof. And speaking of daily bread, let's talk about how these guys got paid, or more accurately, underpaid. Carpenters' wages were notoriously low, often 2 to 3 pence a day, equivalent to what a skilled laborer might earn. To add insult to injury, this was barely enough to cover the essentials, let alone elevate one's social standing. It's like working overtime for minimum wage while your boss drives home in a chariot made of gold. But hey, at least there was job security, right? Not quite. While there was always something that needed building or repairing, the work was irregular and seasonal. You might be in high demand for a few months, only to find yourself scrambling for scraps when the weather turned foul or the local lord decided his castle didn't need another moat. It's feast or famine medieval style. And then there were the guilds, those medieval trade unions that were supposed to offer some semblance of stability. Joining a guild was like being inducted into an exclusive club where the membership card was a chisel and a strong back. Guilds set standards, negotiated wages, and provided a network that could mean the difference between thriving and starving. They also ran apprenticeships, a kind of medieval boot camp where young hopefuls learned the trade from seasoned veterans. Apprenticeships were the first rung on the carpenter's ladder, often starting at the tender age of 12. For 7 years, you'd be learning the ropes, or rather, the saws and hammers, under the watchful eye of a master carpenter. It was a rigorous process, akin to a medieval reality show where you learn not just the skills, but also the social navigation required to survive in a cutthroat industry. At the end of it, if you were lucky, you graduate to journeyman status, able to work for pay and perhaps dream of becoming a master one day. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of the guild. Sure, they offered protection and camaraderie, but they were also gatekeepers, controlling who got in and who stayed out. If you didn't play by their rules, you could find yourself blacklisted faster than you could say timber. And if you were hoping for upward mobility, well, let's just say the guild wasn't handing out golden hammers for excellence in carpentry. The myth of the noble artisan, crafting beauty from wood, often crumbles under the weight of everyday struggles. Life was a constant grind, with each plank and beam a testament to sheer necessity rather than creative glory. The romantic notion of the medieval carpenter as a revered craftsman falls flat when faced with the reality of back-breaking labor, low pay, and limited social mobility. Yet there was a certain gritty satisfaction in the work. Despite the hardships, carpenters took pride in their craft, knowing their work was integral to the fabric of medieval life. They were the silent architects of history, shaping the world one beam at a time, even if society never paused to acknowledge their contributions. It's this blend of unrecognized talent and relentless toil that makes the medieval carpenter a fascinating figure, one whose story is as complex as the structures they built. And while we're busy busting myths, let's talk about the so-called camaraderie among craftsmen. Sure, there was a sense of community, but it was less about exchanging pleasantries over ale and more about surviving a brutally competitive market. Carpenters often had to work alongside other tradesmen, stonemasons, blacksmiths, roofers, each with their own guilds, rules and rivalries. It was a medieval melting pot, but one where the ladle was made of iron, and the stew was often spiced with a dash of animosity. In this web of medieval economics, carpenters had to be both craftsmen and diplomats, navigating relationships with patrons, guild members, and fellow laborers. It was a constant balancing act, requiring not just skill with tools, but savvy in social maneuvering. You had to know when to stand firm and when to bend, much like the timber you shaped daily. So, as we leave our medieval carpenters in their dusty workshops, let's remember them not just as artisans, but as survivors in a world that often took their contributions for granted. They may not have been celebrated in their time, but their legacy is etched in the wooden beams and stone walls that still stand today. And while their lives were often more about endurance than enjoyment, They carved out a niche in history that endures to this day. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover in the tale of the medieval carpenter's gritty, splinter-filled life. But let's not throw the chisel out with the shavings just yet. The medieval carpenter's tale doesn't end in a dusty workshop. It echoes through the ages, in the grand arches and sturdy beams that still stand today. Their legacy is quite literally carved into the very bones of our modern world. The castles they constructed became the blueprints for architectural feats that followed. From Windsor Castle to the Notre Dame Cathedral, these structures weren't just buildings. They were statements, fortified poems in stone and wood. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find that the groundwork laid by these carpenters gave rise to the architectural styles that define the Renaissance and beyond. The precision and techniques they pioneered, like the use of morais and tenon joints, are still fundamentals in carpentry today. And while the medieval carpenter wasn't exactly rolling in riches, their work laid the economic foundation for the bustling trade and industry that the future would rely on. Without their contributions, the Industrial Revolution might have stalled before it even started, leaving us to ponder a world where steam engines and skyscrapers remained figments of the imagination. Now, let's get a little philosophical. Don't worry, we won't go full Aristotle on you. There's something profoundly human about the legacy of these carpenters. It's a testament to resilience, to the ability to create and endure, even when life handed them little more than splinters and sweat. Their hard lives are a stark contrast to the romanticized notions that often paint the Middle Ages as a time of knights and chivalry. In reality, it was more about grit and tenacity, about working with what you had and making it count. You might say the medieval carpenter was the original underdog, crafting masterpieces under conditions that would send most of us running for the nearest ergonomic chair. And speaking of contrasts, let's debunk one more myth before we wrap this up. The idea that medieval carpenters were solitary geniuses, toiling away in isolation, misses the mark by a medieval mile. They were part of a vibrant, albeit chaotic, community that was as interwoven as the timbers they worked with. They shared techniques, competed for jobs, and even sometimes collaborated on grand projects that required more than one pair of calloused hands. This communal aspect of their work laid the foundation for the collaborative endeavors that define modern construction and design. It's a legacy of teamwork, where each craftsman's skill was a note in the symphony of creation. So, before we close the book on these unsung heroes, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of their existence. They didn't just build structures, they built the scaffolding for an era, one beam at a time. Their contributions were the silent engines of progress, driving societies forward even when they themselves remained rooted in the mud of medieval life. It's a legacy that speaks to the enduring power of human creativity and the ability to transform raw materials into something greater than the sum of its parts. As we bid farewell to our medieval carpenters, let's carry forward a bit of their spirit. Remember that every nail hammered, every beam lifted, was a step toward a future they could scarcely imagine. They may not have had the luxury of seeing their names etched in history, but their work remains a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. And who knows, next time you find yourself frustrated with a flat-pack furniture assembly, you might just channel a bit of that medieval grit and get the job done with a little more appreciation for the artisans of old. After all, those carpenters didn't just craft wood, they crafted history. In a dusty corner of the world that would one day hum with the echoes of revolution, a baby was born who would change the course of history. Mvizo, a village so small it barely registers on a map, was the unlikely starting point for Nelson Raleigh Mandela, who made his grand entrance on July 18, 1918. Raleigh, by the way, translates to pulling the branch of a tree, or more colloquially, troublemaker, a fitting name for someone who would go on to shake the very roots of South African society. Mandela was no ordinary child, not least because he was born into the Thembu royal family, which is about as close as you could get to nobility in rural South Africa. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniswa, was a respected local chief and councillor to the Thembu monarchy. His mother, No Skinny Fanny, was his third of 4 wives, so if you thought your family dynamics were complex, think again. Mandela's early life was a tapestry of traditional customs and leadership ideals, woven together with the thread of rural simplicity. The young Nelson would listen to stories of the African past, told by the elders, that planted the seeds of his future convictions. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before he was Nelson, the emblem of resistance, he was Raleigh Lala, the kid who had to hoof it to school barefoot across the countryside. Education, you see, was both a blessing and a bizarrely regimented affair. He attended a local Methodist school where, in a strange twist of colonial irony, his teacher gave him the name Nelson on his first day, because nothing screams colonial influence like being named after a British sea hero. Young Mandela was bright, but not exactly a Rhodes Scholar. His academic record was a mixed bag of enthusiasm and, let's say, room for improvement. His journey took him to the elite Fort Hare University, a breeding ground for future African leaders. Picture it as the Ivy League of South Africa, but with more cultural significance and fewer latte-sipping undergrads. Mandela was one of the few black students privileged enough to attend, joining the ranks of the intellectually curious and politically minded. However, it wasn't all notebooks and scholarly debates. Mandela's time at Fort Hare was also marked by a rebellious streak that foreshadowed his later life. In 1940, he and his friend Oliver Tambo, who would later become his law partner and a key figure in the anti-apartheid movement, were expelled for participating in a student protest against university policies. Yes, long before sit-ins and campus protests became part of student life everywhere, Mandela was already perfecting the art of dissent. The next chapter of his life took a dramatic turn when he returned home to discover that his guardian, the regent of the Thembu people, had arranged a marriage for him. Now, arranged marriages were as traditional as it got, but Mandela was not keen on the idea. In what sounds like the plot of a romantic comedy, Mandela and his cousin Justice fled to Johannesburg to escape their impending nuptials. They borrowed some traditional attire and hitched a ride, effectively ghosting their own weddings. Johannesburg, the city of gold, was a far cry from the rolling hills of the Eastern Cape. It was here that Mandela's political consciousness truly awakened. The city was a melting pot of cultures and ideas, but also a place rife with racial segregation and oppressive policies. If you thought traffic jams were bad, try navigating the social hierarchies and racial barriers of 1940s Johannesburg. Mandela found work as a night watchman at a gold mine, a job that sounds far more glamorous than it was, given the long hours and meager pay. Despite the challenges, it was in Johannesburg that Mandela connected with the African National Congress, ANC, a political party that was slowly transforming from a polite lobbying group into a revolutionary movement. This was the moment when Mandela, the troublemaker, began to morph into Mandela, the freedom fighter. He met activists, intellectuals, and labor leaders who would all play pivotal roles in the struggle against apartheid. He was drawn into debates and discussions that fueled his understanding of social justice and the need for radical change. Mandela's early life was a patchwork of influences and experiences, each adding a layer to his growing understanding of the world and his place within it. From the tales of African warriors told by the fireside to the bustling streets of Johannesburg, these formative years were as much about discovering what he stood against as what he stood for. In a world divided by color and class, Mandela would soon become a beacon of hope and a symbol of resistance. But first, he had to chart his own path, one that would lead him from the dusty roads of Mvizo to the epicenter of the global fight for equality. As Mandela's world expanded, so did his ambitions. In the bustling streets of Johannesburg, he found both opportunity and inequality, like discovering a gourmet meal in a dumpster. The city was a microcosm of the larger tensions brewing in South Africa. It was here, in the 1940, that Mandela truly began to carve out his political identity, transitioning from a curious observer to an active participant in the fight against apartheid. If you think your career path is a winding road, Mandela's was more like a roller coaster with occasional free falls. Having ditched the night watchman gig, Mandela took up law studies at the University of Witwatersrand, or WITS, as it's affectionately known. Despite the university's progressive veneer, Mandela was one of only a handful of black students in a sea of white faces. It was like being the lone vegan at a Texas barbecue. But instead of retreating, Mandela used this as a platform to connect with a diverse group of students and future allies, honing his skills in debate and diplomacy. In 1944, Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, a move akin to signing up for a marathon when you've only ever jogged on weekends. But Mandela wasn't just interested in jogging. He wanted to sprint towards change. The ANC at the time was a bit like a polite book club, lots of discussions, but not much action. Mandela and his comrades, including Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, decided it was time to spice things up. They formed the ANC Youth League, a group that aimed to shake the dust off the ANC's slippers and get it marching in boots. The Youth League was all about action, advocating for a more militant approach to challenge the status quo. They were like the punk rockers of South African politics, minus the mohawks and leather jackets. The Youth League's manifesto called for a radical and militant program, and Mandela was at the heart of this new direction. It was here that he began to shed the gentle revolutionary skin. Because let's be honest, sometimes you need more than polite petitions to dismantle an oppressive regime. The 1950 saw Mandela's political star rising as fast as a helium balloon in a vacuum. In 1952, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, a mass protest against apartheid laws. This wasn't just a sit-in or a silent march. It was a full-blown act of civil disobedience. Participants deliberately broke apartheid laws, like entering whites-only areas, a bold move considering the potential consequences. Imagine jaywalking in a town where the punishment was a year in jail, and you get a sense of the stakes. Mandela was appointed National Volunteer-in-Chief, a title that sounds like it belongs to a Boy Scout leader, but carried significantly more risk. He traveled across South Africa, rallying people to the cause. The campaign attracted over 8,000 volunteers who were arrested for their defiance. It was a numbers game, and Mandela was playing to win, or at least draw enough attention to force change. The campaign might not have dismantled apartheid, but it certainly put the regime on notice and united people across racial and social lines. But let's debunk the myth of the gentle revolutionary. Mandela's decisions were anything but easy. The ANC Youth League's push for more militant tactics was controversial, even within the ANC. Mandela understood that sometimes you have to throw a stone to stir the pond, risking backlash and misunderstanding. He wasn't advocating violence for violence's sake, but he recognized that the oppressive system was not going to crumble from a sternly worded letter. In the midst of this political turmoil, Mandela's personal life was equally complex. In 1958, he married his second wife, Winnie Madikizela. Their relationship would become as iconic as it was tumultuous, marked by long separations due to Mandela's political activities. It's the classic story of a working couple struggling to balance career and family, except the careers involved overthrowing a government and facing jail time. The economic landscape of South Africa in the 1950s was a twisted jungle of inequality. While white South Africans enjoyed the fruits of industrial growth, black South Africans were relegated to low-paying jobs, if employed at all. This wasn't just a battle for political rights. It was an economic struggle with entire communities living in poverty. The system was designed to keep black South Africans in a perpetual state of disadvantage, a bit like playing Monopoly without being allowed to pass go or collect $200. As Mandela's legal career blossomed, he and Oliver Tambo opened the first black law firm in South Africa, a bold move akin to opening a vegan cafe in cattle country. Mandela used his legal skills to defend those charged under apartheid laws, offering a glimmer of hope in a justice system that was anything but just. In 1955, the Congress of the People adopted the Freedom Charter, a document that declared, "The people shall govern." It was a revolutionary vision for a non-racial South Africa, and Mandela was instrumental in its creation. This was the blueprint for the future, laying out a vision of equality and democracy. Yet, while the charter was a beacon of hope, the government saw it as a threat, leading to the infamous treason trial of 1956, where Mandela and 155 others were arrested and charged with treason. There's nothing quite like being accused of treason to spice up your resume. As the trial dragged on, Mandela's resolve only strengthened. The charges were eventually dropped, But the trial underscored the high stakes and constant danger faced by Mandela and his comrades. It was a reminder that the path to freedom was fraught with peril, and Mandela was prepared to walk it, no matter the cost. So, as Mandela navigated the political whirlwinds of the 1940s and 50s, he wasn't just a gentle revolutionary. He was a strategic, determined force of nature. He understood that true change required more than words. It demanded action and sacrifice. And while the myth of the gentle revolutionary is a comforting narrative, the reality was far more complex, with Mandela making tough choices at every turn. But then again, history rarely makes heroes out of those who play it safe. As we leave behind the tumultuous 1950s, Mandela's story takes a sharp turn into the infamous Rivonia trial of 1963-64. Now, imagine a courtroom drama where the stakes aren't just high, they are stratospheric. We're talking about a trial that could easily have been penned by a thriller novelist. But this was real life, with real danger and no Hollywood ending in sight. Rivonia trial was named after the Johannesburg suburb, where police unearthed the headquarters of a group planning to overthrow the apartheid regime. During a raid on Lillisleaf Farm in Rivonia, police arrested key leaders of the African National Congress, ANC, including Nelson Mandela, who was already serving a 5-year sentence for leaving the country illegally and inciting a strike. Clearly, Mandela's to-do list was a bit more intense than most people's grocery runs. The charges were serious: sabotage, which carried the death penalty. To the apartheid government, these men were not just political dissidents, they were public enemy number one. The trial began in October 1963, and the defendants, including Walter Sisulu, Garvin Mbeki, and Ahmed Kathrada, faced a judiciary system that could charitably be described as not exactly impartial. In fact, it was as biased as a referee with skin in the game. Mandela's defense strategy was not to deny the charges, but to justify them. He and his co-defendants admitted they had planned sabotage, but not for wanton destruction. They aimed to dismantle apartheid without loss of life. It was a bit like pleading guilty to breaking and entering to save someone from a burning building. They argued that they had exhausted all peaceful means, and faced with a government that only responded to violence, they had no choice but to act. It was during this trial that Mandela delivered his iconic "I am prepared to die" speech. Now, this wasn't just any courtroom monologue. Mandela's speech was a 176-minute masterclass in eloquence and courage. He laid out the ANC's vision for a South Africa where all people could live together in harmony, regardless of race. It was a bold move, essentially telling the court, "I did it, and here's why it matters." His words still echo today. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. The prosecutors must have been sweating more than a snowman in summer, because Mandela's speech resonated worldwide, drawing attention to the injustices of apartheid. But despite the international outcry, the court found Mandela and his co-defendants guilty. Instead of the gallows, they were given life sentences, which might sound like a reprieve, but let's not sugarcoat it. This was no luxury retreat. Robben Island was Mandela's new home, a grim, isolated outpost in the Atlantic Ocean, just 9 kilometers from Cape Town. It was about as close to paradise as a coal mine is to a theme park. The prison conditions were abysmal, with inmates subjected to hard labor and confined to small, damp cells. Mandela's cell was a mere 4 by 2, 1 meters, about the size of a walk-in closet, minus the luxury. Yet, amid the harsh conditions, unexpected camaraderie and even rivalries developed among the prisoners. Imagine a cocktail of intellectuals, activists, and revolutionaries, all crammed together with nothing but time. It was like a think tank with barbed wire, where debates raged over political theories and strategies. Prisoners shared knowledge and taught each other, turning Robben Island into an unofficial university. Mandela, often referred to as the professor, would lead discussions, his leadership undiminished by the prison walls. But let's debunk the romanticized notion that prison life was some kind of Spartan retreat for the mind and soul. It was brutal, plain and simple. Hard labor in the quarry left prisoners with aching bodies and damaged lungs. Meals were meager and nutrition poor, leading to persistent health issues. The guards weren't exactly handing out hugs and warm tea. Either they were tasked with breaking spirits, not fostering community. Despite these hardships, the prisoners forged bonds that transcended personal and political differences. Mandela's ability to connect with others, even those with whom he disagreed, was legendary. He navigated rivalries by focusing on the bigger picture, overcoming apartheid. He exemplified leadership not by command, but by consensus, valuing each person's contribution to the struggle. Mandela's imprisonment also highlighted the absurdities of apartheid justice. The world watched as South Africa continued to marginalize and imprison its most capable leaders. Economic and political pressures mounted, with sanctions and international condemnation casting long shadows over the apartheid regime. So, while Mandela was physically isolated, his influence expanded beyond the prison walls. He became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of the enduring human spirit. His story, woven with threads of struggle and resilience, challenged the world's conscience. Yet, let's not forget the reality behind the legend. A man facing the relentless grind of prison life, holding on to hope when despair would have been the easier option. Mandela and his comrades' time on Robben Island was a testament to their endurance and commitment. They turned a place designed to break them into a crucible of resistance. The friendships and rivalries, the harsh conditions, and the shared dreams all blended into an experience that strengthened their resolve to see a free South Africa. As we close this chapter, remember that Mandela's journey was far from over. His life sentence wasn't the end. It was merely a pause before the crescendo of change that would eventually sweep across South Africa. Stay tuned, because the story of Nelson Mandela is just warming up, and the next act promises to be as riveting as the last. As Mandela settled into the routine of prison life, the world outside was shifting like tectonic plates, with the rumblings of change echoing across the globe. While South Africa's apartheid regime was busy pretending it was business as usual, the international community was increasingly saying, "Not on our watch." This wasn't just a moral stance. It was economic warfare with a side of pop culture awkwardness. Let's dive into the global anti-apartheid movement, the force that turned South Africa into a pariah state. You see, apartheid wasn't just a local issue. It became a global scandal, like a celebrity meltdown, but with much higher stakes. Countries began to impose sanctions, pulling their investments faster than a toddler yanks a tablecloth. The United Nations got involved, calling for an arms embargo in 1963 and later implementing economic sanctions. By the 1980, over 25 countries had adopted restrictive trade measures against South Africa, making it as popular as a skunk at a garden party. But let's not kid ourselves. Some of these countries were slower to act than a sloth in a hammock. For years, economic interests often trumped ethical concerns. It wasn't until the grassroots movements gained momentum that governments started to feel the heat. Activists across the globe organized protests, boycotts, and campaigns that made supporting apartheid about as fashionable as bell-bottoms in the 1990s. Meanwhile, Mandela, the man behind bars, became the face of this international outcry. His name was invoked in student protests from London to Los Angeles, a rallying cry for justice and equality. Yet the myth of Mandela as the solitary hero, sitting stoically in his cell, overlooks the reality of collective struggle. The anti-apartheid movement was a tapestry woven with countless voices, each adding a thread to the call for change. And then there was the soundtrack of resistance, pop culture's sometimes ham-fisted attempt to join the party. Western musicians, often well-meaning but occasionally tone-deaf, penned anthems that ranged from heartfelt to downright cringe-worthy. Take the 1985 hit Sun City by Artists United Against Apartheid, which featured a star-studded lineup, including Bruce Springsteen and Bono. The song was a protest against performing at the Sun City Resort, a glittering gem in the apartheid regime's crown. While the sentiment was spot on, the execution had all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. But let's give credit where it's due. These songs and celebrity endorsements helped keep apartheid in the public eye, turning what could have been a passing outrage into sustained pressure. They showed that sometimes even awkward anthems can have a big impact when they hit the right notes, or at least hit them loudly enough. Back in South Africa, the economic impact of these sanctions was beginning to bite. The rand, South Africa's currency, was wobbling like a Jenga tower in a windstorm. Foreign investments shriveled, and the cost of borrowing soared. By the mid-1980s, South Africa faced a debt crisis, with its foreign debt ballooning to over $20 billion. The apartheid regime was being squeezed financially, and the pressure was mounting. Mandela, imprisoned but not silenced, was acutely aware of these global dynamics. His incarceration became a symbol of the broader struggle, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. Letters smuggled out of prison, often written in the cramped, meticulous script of a man with nothing but time on his hands, continued to inspire activists worldwide. Mandela's voice, quieted but not extinguished, resonated across continents. Let's not forget, though, the fight against apartheid was not just a global affair. It was intensely local. Inside South Africa, the struggle continued with fervor. The African National Congress, ANC, and other resistance movements were relentless, despite facing brutal crackdowns. The 1976 Soweto uprising, where hundreds of students were killed protesting the imposition of Afrikaans in schools, was a flashpoint that galvanized further resistance. It was a stark reminder that the cost of freedom was often paid in blood. South Africa's internal unrest, coupled with international condemnation, created a perfect storm. The apartheid regime found itself increasingly isolated, both economically and politically. The government's attempts to quell dissent with force only fueled more resistance, making it clear that apartheid's days were numbered. As Mandela marked the years in his cell on Robben Island, the world outside was slowly inching towards the realization that apartheid was unsustainable. The myth of the solitary hero was compelling, but the reality was a global chorus demanding change. Mandela's story was intertwined with the collective struggle of millions, each playing a part in the symphony of resistance. So, as we leave this part of Mandela's journey, remember that while he was the face of the movement, he was not its sole architect. The fight against apartheid was a collective endeavor, a testament to the power of unity in the face of oppression. Mandela's release wouldn't be the finale. It was merely the prelude to a new chapter in the quest for equality. Stay tuned, because the crescendo is yet to come. And so, the world watched with bated breath as Nelson Mandela, the man who had become a symbol of enduring hope, finally stepped out of Victor Verster prison on February 11, 1990. At this point, you might imagine a triumphant soundtrack blaring, the sun casting dramatic shadows as Mandela took his first steps into freedom. But this wasn't a Hollywood blockbuster. It was history in the making, with all its unfiltered complexity. Mandela's release was not just about one man regaining his freedom. It was the dawning of a new era in South African politics. Mandela's liberation was a strategic move by then-President F.W. de Klerk, who realized that apartheid was as viable as a chocolate teapot. The economy was in shambles, and international sanctions had morphed from a nuisance into an existential threat. South Africa was like a ship taking on water, and de Klerk figured it was time to bail out before they all sank. His decision to release Mandela and unban political parties, like the African National Congress, ANC, was a calculated risk, but one that paid off by setting the stage for negotiations to end apartheid. Now, Mandela wasn't stepping into a neatly packaged democracy waiting to be unwrapped. No, he was walking into a nation teetering on the edge of chaos, with racial tensions bubbling like a pot ready to boil over. The transition from apartheid to democracy was akin to conducting open-heart surgery on a marathon runner mid-race. It required precision, patience, and a touch of audacity. Mandela's presidency, which began in 1994, was a masterclass in reconciliation and nation-building. But let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't a victory lap through a field of daisies. The first democratically elected leader of South Africa had to navigate a minefield of social and economic challenges. The economy was about as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane, with unemployment rates soaring and a GDP growth rate that barely flickered above 2% in his first year in office. One of the most significant initiatives during Mandela's presidency was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in 1995. Chaired by the indefatigable Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the TRC was tasked with the Herculean job of healing a nation scarred by decades of racial violence. It was a bold experiment in restorative justice, where victims and perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes could share their stories, seek forgiveness, or at the very least, confront the truth. The TRC hearings were a double-edged sword, cathartic for some, gut-wrenching for others. They exposed the raw, unvarnished truths of apartheid's brutality, with stories that could chill even the most hardened souls. The Commission granted amnesty to those who fully confessed their politically motivated crimes, a decision that sparked heated debate. Critics argued it allowed perpetrators to escape justice, while proponents saw it as a necessary step towards reconciliation. The process was as messy as a teenager's bedroom, but it was a crucial step in knitting the torn fabric of South African society back together. Mandela himself was a beacon of unity, but let's not fall into the trap of deifying him as a saintly figure who floated above mere mortals. He was, after all, human, grappling with personal and political challenges that would make lesser individuals crumble. His marriage to Winnie Mandela, once the romanticized Barney to his Clyde, ended in divorce in 1996 amid allegations of infidelity and political differences. It was a reminder that behind the public persona, Mandela was a man with his own share of heartaches and missteps. Economically, Mandela's government faced the monumental task of addressing the disparities entrenched by decades of apartheid. The economy needed a jump-start, but there was no magic wand to wave away the structural inequalities. The Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, aimed to tackle issues like housing, education, and healthcare, but results were mixed. Progress was slower than a snail on a leisurely stroll, constrained by limited resources and the sheer scale of the challenges. Yet, amidst the trials and tribulations, Mandela achieved what many thought impossible. He maintained the peace. His ability to bridge divides and promote reconciliation was akin to walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers, requiring both skill and nerves of steel. Under his leadership, South Africa transformed from an international pariah to a respected member of the global community, hosting events like the 1995 Rugby World Cup, where Mandela famously donned the Springboks jersey, a powerful symbol of unity in a divided nation. As Mandela's presidency drew to a close in 1999, he left behind a legacy that was both monumental and unfinished. His journey from prisoner to president was nothing short of epic, a testament to the power of resilience and forgiveness. But let's not romanticize it to the point of distortion. Mandela was a man, not a messiah. His presidency wasn't a fairy tale. It was a complex narrative filled with triumphs, setbacks, and the relentless pursuit of a better future. Mandela's legacy is a tapestry woven from the threads of courage, humility, and an unwavering commitment to justice. He didn't single-handedly dismantle apartheid or build a new South Africa. He was part of a broader movement, a conductor in a vast orchestra of change. The journey towards equality, justice, and economic prosperity in South Africa continues, a testament to Mandela's vision, but also a reminder of the work that remains. In the end, Mandela's story is not just about one man's quest for freedom. It's a narrative about the enduring struggle for human dignity, a call to action for generations to come. As we reflect on his life, let's embrace both the myth and the reality, the legend and the man. Mandela taught us that change is possible, but it's neither easy nor inevitable. It requires the courage to confront the past, the wisdom to build a better future, and the resilience to keep moving forward, one step at a time. In the windswept steppes of Mongolia, where a bad hair day could mean your hat blew off into the next khanate, a boy named Temujin was born around 1162. Now, if you think your family gatherings are awkward, wait till you hear about Temujin's childhood. His father, Yesuje, was poisoned by a rival clan when Temujin was just 9. As if being a preteen wasn't traumatic enough, his father's death left his family abandoned by their own tribe. Suddenly, this kid was thrust into a survival scenario that would make even Bear Grylls sweat. Now, I know what you're thinking. Great, another tragic hero origin story. But Temujin's early years were less about brooding and more about dodging betrayal, and believe it or not, camel theft. Yes, folks, in the 12th century Mongolian steppes, stealing camels was the equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover. After his father's demise, Temujin's family was left to fend for themselves. They were so broke that even their yurt had a draft. But here's the kicker. It's precisely this rough and tumble upbringing that sharpened Temujin into a man who could unite quarreling tribes into a fearsome empire. One of the most colorful episodes from his youth involved his half-brother, Begta. Temujin, not one to hold grudges quietly, took sibling rivalry to a murderous level. In an escalation that makes Cain and Abel look like a playground spat, Temujin killed Begta during a family dispute. It's not exactly the plot for a feel-good family sitcom, unless your idea of conflict resolution involves a bow and arrow. But this act was less about personal vendetta and more about solidifying his shaky authority within the family. A dark deed, sure, but in the ruthless world of steppe politics, it was practically a rite of passage. As Temujin grew, so did his ambition. He was a master of unconventional tactics, which in the wild world of medieval politics was as necessary as a good horse. He was captured by a rival tribe, the Teochead, who held him in a wooden collar like a medieval dog show contestant. But Temujin, ever the escape artist, managed to wriggle out of this predicament thanks to a sympathetic guard. And you thought your last escape room was hard. This experience taught him the value of loyalty and the importance of knowing when to charm your captors, or, just run really fast. By the time he was in his early 20s, Temujin had started assembling a loyal following. He didn't just rely on family ties or traditional loyalties, which in his case were about as reliable as a Mongolian weather forecast. Instead, he promoted soldiers based on merit. This was revolutionary. Forget nepotism. Temujin was like the Steve Jobs of the steppe, handpicking talent based on ability, not lineage. His band of followers slowly morphed into a formidable force, a ragtag crew ready to shake up the status quo. But let's not sugarcoat it. Uniting the Mongol tribes was like herding cats, if the cats were heavily armed and had a penchant for blood feuds. Yet, Temujin had a knack for diplomacy, or at least a version of it that involved strategic marriages and occasionally, yes, more betrayals. He married Bert, who not only became his queen, but also a key political ally. Their marriage was more than a union of two people. It was a merger of clans, each bringing a little less murder and a little more alliance to the table. Fast forward to 1206, the big year when Temujin, now rechristened as Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, managed to unite the fractious Mongol tribes. This was no small feat. He transformed infighting tribes into a unified force, ready to storm the gates of the world. And let's be honest, in a land where a misplaced yurt pin could start a war, this was monumental. Genghis Khan's unification of the Mongols wasn't just a regional shake-up. It was the starting pistol for one of history's most expansive empires. So how did he pull off this tribal unification miracle? Well, he didn't play by medieval rules. Genghis Khan implemented a system of laws called the Yasa, a sort of proto-constitution that emphasized loyalty, discipline, and somewhat ironically, justice. It was a code that valued meritocracy and religious tolerance, concepts that were about as common in 13th century Mongolia as Wi-Fi. His blend of shrewd diplomacy, strategic marriages, and a bit of good old-fashioned intimidation laid the foundation for his empire. In conclusion, the rise of Genghis Khan from the dusty plains of Mongolia to the throne of a nascent empire is not just a tale of sweeping conquests and epic battles. It's about a man who took the chaos of his childhood and turned it into a blueprint for empire building. His story reminds us that even the most unassuming beginnings can lead to world-changing legacies, especially if you can handle a bit of camel theft along the way. Now, with the Mongol tribes united under Genghis Khan's banner, the real fun began. We're talking about transforming a ragtag bunch of horsemen into history's most feared military machine. It's like taking a neighborhood soccer team and turning them into World Cup champions, but with more swords and a lot more galloping. Let's start with the cavalry. The Mongol army was essentially one big equestrian club with a penchant for warfare. Each soldier had multiple horses, 3 to 5 on average, which meant they could rotate mounts and cover astonishing distances. These guys could travel up to 100 miles a day. That's the medieval equivalent of having a Tesla with unlimited supercharging. And while other armies were slogging through mud on foot, the Mongols were zipping around like the FedEx of destruction, delivering chaos from Beijing to Baghdad. But it wasn't just about having horsepower. Genghis Khan's real genius lay in his ability to innovate. He introduced a decimal system for organizing his troops. Units of 10, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Sounds simple, right? But in an era when most armies were about as organized as a toddler's toy box, this was revolutionary. It meant that his forces could act in concert, whether they were conducting a full frontal assault or a complex feigned retreat. A favorite Mongol trick that lured enemies into traps with the subtlety of a Hollywood plot twist. And then there's the psychological warfare. If you thought the Mongols just rode in, swords swinging, think again. Genghis Khan was a master of terror and deception. He used a combination of propaganda, fear, and negotiation to subdue cities before a single arrow was fired. For instance, he would often send envoys to a city with an offer: surrender and live, or resist and face utter destruction. Given that the Mongols had a reputation for reducing cities to ash, sometimes literally burning them to the ground, many chose the former. When it came to sieges, the Mongols didn't just rely on brute force. Oh no, they were the MacGyvers of medieval warfare, using whatever was at hand to get the job done. They adopted siege technologies from conquered peoples, like the Chinese, who had developed some pretty nifty catapults. These weren't your typical rock-flinging machines. They could hurl projectiles over 300 pounds. Imagine being on the receiving end of that delivery. Of course, the Mongols weren't above using a little dark humor in their tactics. One famous story involves the siege of a city where they ran out of ammunition. So what did they do? They launched diseased carcasses over the walls, effectively conducting early biological warfare. Talk about thinking outside the box, or in this case, the catapult. But here's the thing. Success wasn't just about scaring the daylights out of people. It was about logistics, logistics, logistics. Genghis Khan understood that an army marches on its stomach. Well, rides, in his case. His military campaigns were meticulously planned to ensure that his troops were well fed and their horses well watered. Supply lines were crucial, and the Mongols maintained them with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. They even established a kind of medieval postal service, the YAM system, with relay stations spread across the empire, allowing for rapid communication and movement of supplies. It was the Amazon Prime of the 13th century, minus the 2-day delivery guarantee. Despite their fearsome reputation, the Mongols were surprisingly adaptable in less-than-ideal situations. Take the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, for instance. When the Shah of Khwarezm executed Genghis Khan's envoys, a major faux pas in the diplomatic world, Genghis retaliated with one of his most famous campaigns. Faced with scorching deserts and hostile terrain, the Mongols adapted their tactics and supply routes, even employing local guides to navigate the treacherous landscapes. The result? The Khwarezmian Empire was dismantled faster than you can say bad career move. And let's not forget the discipline. Mongol soldiers were held to strict standards. Looting without permission, forget it. There were harsh penalties for disobedience, which kept the troops in line and focused on the mission. This level of discipline, combined with their innovative strategies, made the Mongol army not just a force to be reckoned with, but a force that reshaped the world map. So, while Genghis Khan's empire-building efforts are often remembered for their brutality, and let's be honest, they were pretty brutal, it's the combination of strategic genius, psychological cunning, and logistical mastery that truly set his military machine apart. It's a lesson in how the right blend of innovation, efficiency, and a touch of terror can turn even the most improbable of armies into an unstoppable force. And we're just getting started on this Mongol roller coaster, so hang tight as we continue to unravel the legacy of one of history's most enigmatic conquerors. So, as we gallop onward on this Mongolian roller coaster, let's talk about the Mongol Empire at its absolute zenith. Imagine this. Genghis Khan's empire stretched over 27 million square miles. Yes, you heard that right. That's nearly a quarter of the Earth's land area. To put that in modern terms, if the Mongol Empire were around today, you'd still need a passport and a good Wi-Fi plan to navigate it. It was the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, and it was all built on horseback. Now, you might be wondering how on earth Genghis Khan managed to keep tabs on an empire that was basically a medieval version of the Amazon distribution network. Well, that's where the Mongol administration comes into play, a system that made the IRS look like a lemonade stand. Genghis had a knack for picking the right people for the job, regardless of their background. This was no aristocracy by birth. It was a meritocracy, baby. If you could get the job done, you got the job. It's like the ultimate job interview where your resume doesn't matter, but your ability to conquer does. The Mongols were pioneers in setting up a postal system known as the Yam, which was essentially the ancient world's version of overnight delivery. Picture this: a network of relay stations scattered across the empire, complete with fresh horses and riders, ready to zip messages across continents faster than you can say, "Where's my package?" This genius system allowed for rapid communication, which was critical for managing such a sprawling territory. It was the medieval equivalent of sending a text message, just with a bit more hoof power and a lot less autocorrect. But let's not sugarcoat it. Running this mammoth empire was no walk in the yurt. The Mongols had to contend with a dizzying array of challenges, from diverse cultures to hostile landscapes. It's like trying to organize a family reunion when half the relatives don't speak the same language and the other half are allergic to the main course. Yet, despite these hurdles, the Mongol administration was surprisingly efficient. They implemented a system of local governance that allowed for a degree of autonomy, which was crucial in maintaining order across such a vast realm. And let's talk trade. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, was not just a catchy slogan. It was a game-changer for commerce. Under the Mongol rule, the Silk Road reached its zenith, and trade flourished like never before. Caravans laden with silk, spices, and precious stones traversed the empire, bringing wealth and prosperity to the regions they touched. This wasn't just some dusty trade route. It was the medieval superhighway of economic exchange. The Mongols even guaranteed the safety of travelers, which was a big plus unless you fancied getting ambushed by bandits. But here's the kicker. The Mongols didn't just demand tribute. They facilitated a level of cultural exchange that was unprecedented. Imagine Italian merchants sipping tea in Beijing or Persian scholars exchanging ideas in Karakoram. It was like the first international TED talk circuit, minus the PowerPoint presentations. And while the Mongols were busy building bridges, both literally and metaphorically, they also laid the groundwork for the globalized world we know today. Of course, managing such a vast empire wasn't all sunshine and silk. The bureaucracy, while effective, was a bit like herding cats if the cats were also trying to outsmart each other. There were constant power struggles, and the complexities of governance were enough to make even the most seasoned administrators head spin. Yet, the Mongols embraced a pragmatic approach, adopting the best administrative practices from the cultures they conquered, from Chinese bureaucratic techniques to Persian fiscal policies. It was an empire built on borrowed brilliance, a testament to their adaptability and resourcefulness. Now, if you're picturing the Mongol Empire as a well-oiled machine, let me add a dash of reality to your daydream. The challenges of medieval bureaucracy were as absurd as they were frustrating. Imagine trying to get a decree passed when your council is scattered across thousands of miles, each member dealing with their own local crises. It was like trying to organize a Zoom call when half the participants are in different time zones and the other half are still figuring out how to unmute themselves. But despite these challenges, the Mongols managed to maintain a level of stability that was nothing short of miraculous. They understood the importance of infrastructure, and they invested heavily in roads, bridges, and communication networks. This was the backbone of their empire, ensuring that goods, ideas, and orders could flow seamlessly across vast distances. In many ways, it was the Mongols' commitment to connectivity that kept their empire from fracturing under its own weight. And let's not forget the economic benefits that underpinned the empire's stability. The Mongols didn't just conquer for the sake of conquest. They understood the value of trade and commerce. By securing trade routes and protecting merchants, they created an environment where economic activity could flourish. It was a win-win situation, where both the conquerors and the conquered could reap the rewards of prosperity. In conclusion, as we dissect the Mongol Empire at its peak, it's clear that Genghis Khan's legacy was built on more than just military might. It was a complex tapestry of innovation, administration, and economic savvy. The Mongols weren't just warriors. They were statesmen, economists, and visionaries who reshaped the world in their image. And as we continue to unravel this epic saga, one thing is certain. The impact of Genghis Khan's empire echoes far beyond the steppes of Mongolia leaving an indelible mark on history that still resonates today. But don't saddle up just yet. There's still more to uncover on this wild ride through the annals of history. As the Mongol Empire galloped forward on the winds of history, Genghis Khan's legacy began to warp and weave into the fabric of myth and reality. Now, let's face it, Genghis has been painted with many brushes. Some see him as a barbarian brute, others as a savvy state builder, and a few even as a misunderstood visionary ahead of his time. But let's not get too carried away with the whole noble savage narrative. Sure, he had a knack for uniting tribes and a penchant for administrative innovation, but let's not forget the wake of chaos he left behind. The truth, it's as complex as a Mongolian knot. First off, the romanticized image of Genghis Khan as some sort of wild, unrefined genius is tempting, but it's not entirely accurate. The noble savage trope paints him as a ruthless yet honorable warrior with a heart of gold hidden under layers of hardened leather armor. But the reality, Genghis was as strategic as he was brutal. His campaigns weren't just about expanding territory. They were about restructuring the very fabric of societies. Just ask the citizens of Nishapur, who witnessed the city razed to the ground in a fit of vengeance. It was less about noble conquest and more about sending a message, loud and clear. And let's bust another bubble. The Mongol conquests were not some grand, civilized mission to spread culture and enlightenment. Sure, they facilitated cultural exchange, but often unintentionally. Their real aim was control and tribute. Genghis wasn't handing out scholarships to the school of Mongol management. He was collecting taxes, and lots of them. The economic upheaval, enormous. Cities that resisted were often obliterated, and those that complied were swiftly integrated into the Mongol tax machine. It was a medieval version of monopoly, except when you landed on Genghis's properties, you paid in gold or blood. Economic realities under the Mongol rule were a mixed bag of prosperity and peril. On one hand, the Pax Mongolica turned the Silk Road into a bustling artery of commerce, a superhighway of silks, spices, and ideas. On the other, the constant warfare and tribute demands disrupted local economies and displaced entire populations. The Mongol tax collectors were as relentless as they were efficient, and they didn't take IOUs. It was a time when the price of peace was steep, and the cost of rebellion even steeper. Now, don't get me wrong, the Mongols did inadvertently become early promoters of globalization. Their empire was a melting pot of cultures, cuisines, and technologies. Take the culinary exchanges, for instance. Spices from India, noodles from China, and wines from Persia all found their way into Mongol camps. Picture this, a Mongol feast with dumplings, kebabs, and a side of fermented mare's milk. The empire was like a medieval food truck festival, albeit with more sabers and less Instagramming. Technological exchanges were equally significant. Gunpowder, for example, made its way west thanks to the rapid Mongol expansion. Paper currency, a Chinese invention, was adopted and spread through the empire, revolutionizing trade and transactions. This wasn't your average barter economy. It was a cash economy on horseback. And let's not forget the spread of knowledge. The Mongols, surprisingly, valued scholars and artisans, often sparing them during conquests and integrating their skills into the empire. It was a brain drain for conquered regions, a brain gain for the Mongols. Genghis Khan also inadvertently became a patron of the arts, albeit in a roundabout way. By relocating artisans and scholars across the empire, he fostered a cross-pollination of artistic styles and techniques. Persian miniatures found new life in Mongol courts, while Chinese porcelain became a coveted luxury item far beyond its homeland. It was a cultural renaissance born out of conquest, a reminder that even amidst destruction, creation finds a way. But let's not romanticize the chaos too much. While the Mongols facilitated these exchanges, they were also responsible for some serious social upheaval. Entire populations were relocated, either as part of the spoils of war or as a strategic move to quell rebellion. This wasn't a gentle migration. It was forced relocation on an imperial scale. Communities were shattered, and traditional power structures were upended. It was like a medieval game of musical chairs, except the stakes involved your home and livelihood. And then there's the darker side of Genghis's legacy, the sheer human cost of his campaigns. Estimates suggest that his conquests resulted in the deaths of millions, a chilling testament to his ruthlessness. The romantic image of the Mongol warrior as a noble, wandering knight quickly fades when you consider the scale of devastation. Cities like Herat and Merv were left as ghost towns, their populations decimated. The Mongol peace came at a bloody price, one that history often glosses over in favor of tales of glory and grandeur. So, as we unravel the myths surrounding Genghis Khan, it's clear that his legacy is a tangled web of contradictions. He was a conqueror and a unifier, a destroyer and a creator, a tyrant and a trailblazer. His empire was a crossroads of cultures and a crucible of conflict, a place where the old world met the new in a cacophony of clashing swords and clinking coins. Genghis's impact on the world was profound, but it was also profoundly complex, a reminder that history is rarely black and white. As we continue this wild ride through Genghis Khan's world, remember, the truth of his legacy lies somewhere between the legend and the reality. It's a story as vast and varied as the steppes he once ruled, filled with triumphs, tragedies, and more than a few surprises. So hold onto your hats, because the Mongol roller coaster is far from over, and there's still more history to unravel in the tales of Genghis Khan and his empire. But hold your horses, literally and figuratively, because while Genghis Khan was busy painting the world map with a broad brush of conquest, the story didn't end with him. When he died in 1227, his empire didn't just vanish like a puff of smoke from a Mongolian campfire. Instead, it entered a new chapter, a saga of familial bickering and territorial splits that would make any soap opera look tame. First, let's talk succession. Genghis Khan's empire was like a giant game of Risk, and after his death, his sons inherited the board. They divvied up the empire into 4 khanates, each governed by one of Genghis's descendants. Now, if you think splitting a pizza among siblings is tough, try dividing 27 million square miles of diverse and often hostile territory. It was like trying to divvy up the last slice of cake at a birthday party, except with more swords and fewer paper plates. The sons of Genghis Khan, notably Urgidei, Talui, Chagatai, and Jarchai, were tasked with maintaining this colossal empire. Urgidei took charge as the great Khan, and with him at the helm, the Mongol Empire continued its expansion. He was like the CEO who inherits a booming startup and decides to take it global. Under his leadership, the Mongols even managed to conquer the Jin dynasty in China and make significant inroads into Eastern Europe. It was as if the Mongol Empire was saying, "Why stop when you're on a roll?" But here's the twist. While the empire was expanding, it was also fraying at the edges. The unity that Genghis had so meticulously crafted began to unravel as each khanate pursued its own interests. The Golden Horde in the northwest, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China all started to drift apart, each like a teenager wanting to move out and find their own identity. It was a classic case of too many cooks in the kitchen, with each one trying to make their own dish. But the most significant blows came from within. The Mongols, once united under a single banner, now found themselves embroiled in internal conflicts. The Khanates often fought each other as much as they did external enemies. It was like a family reunion gone horribly wrong, with everyone arguing over inheritance while trying to keep the family business afloat. The power struggles were as relentless as a Mongolian winter, and they chipped away at the empire's cohesion. Economically, the empire faced challenges as well. The Pax Mongolica, which had once facilitated trade across the empire, began to falter. The Silk Road, once a bustling superhighway, saw a decline in traffic as the Khanates squabbled. It's like the Wi-Fi going down during a crucial video call. Commerce stalled, and the once flourishing trade networks began to wither. The economic prosperity that had bolstered the empire's stability became a faint memory, replaced by scarcity and fragmentation. But let's not forget the unexpected legacies the Mongols left behind. While the empire fractured, their influence endured in surprising ways. The Mongol conquests had inadvertently spread technology, culture, and even diseases across continents. The introduction of gunpowder to Europe, for instance, was a game-changer that eventually altered the face of warfare. Talk about unintended consequences. It's like inventing fire and accidentally starting a barbecue revolution. Moreover, the Mongols had set the stage for a more interconnected world. Their empire had been a melting pot of cultures, And even after its decline, the cross-cultural exchanges continued to resonate. The Mongols had unwittingly laid the groundwork for globalization long before the term even existed. It was a world where ideas and innovations flowed across borders, a precursor to the interconnectedness we take for granted today. And while their empire may have crumbled, the Mongols left behind a legacy of adaptability and resilience. They had shown that it was possible to unite diverse peoples under a single banner, albeit temporarily. Their story reminds us that empires are as much about the people who build them as they are about the borders they encompass. It's a tale of ambition, audacity, and a fair amount of chaos, a reminder that history is rarely a smooth ride. In the end, the decline of the Mongol Empire was a testament to the complexity of human endeavors. It's easy to romanticize the rise and fall of empires, to see them as grand narratives of conquest and collapse. But the truth is, they're often messy, filled with contradictions and unintended outcomes. The Mongols didn't just ride into history, they rewrote it, leaving behind a legacy that continues to echo through the ages. So, as we wrap up this whirlwind tour of the Mongol Empire, let's take a moment to reflect on the man who started it all. Genghis Khan, the once ostracized boy who rose from the windswept steppes to become a world conqueror, left an indelible mark on history. His empire may have fractured, but his impact endures, a reminder that one man's ambition can indeed reshape the world, even if it's with a bit of camel theft along the way. And there you have it, the Mongol Empire in all its glory and chaos. From its meteoric rise to its inevitable decline, it was a saga of epic proportions, a story of power, passion, and the occasional practical joke with a catapult. So next time you find yourself staring at a map or scrolling through historical memes, spare a thought for Genghis Khan and his band of horsemen who galloped into history and left behind a legacy as vast as the steppes themselves. In the chaotic symphony of human history, the ancient Celts were the rock stars in the age before Twitter wars and Instagram influencers. They swept across Europe like an unstoppable band on a continent-wide tour, from the Iberian Peninsula to the British Isles, around 1200 BCE. These folks were the Iron Age equivalent of a viral sensation, leaving their mark from modern-day Turkey to Ireland. The Celts didn't just stick to one place. They were more like a wandering tribe with a serious case of wanderlust. And who could blame them? Europe was the ultimate stage, just waiting for its headlining act. As the Celts spread their culture, they brought with them a social and political structure that would make a Game of Thrones writer salivate. At the top of this hierarchy stood the Druids, spiritual leaders who were more than just the Gandalf wannabes Hollywood would have you believe. The Druids weren't merely casting spells or brewing potions. They were the intellectual elite. Think of them as the Ivy League professors of their time, but with a bit more flair for the dramatic and a penchant for nature worship. The rise of the Druid class within Celtic society didn't happen overnight. It was as if the Celts realized that having a bunch of sword-wielding warriors was great for conquering, but someone needed to handle the thinking part. Enter the Druids, who were basically the ancient world's answer to Google. They were the keepers of knowledge, the judges, the lawyers, the teachers, and yes, the priests. And here's a fun twist. They did all this without a single written record. They relied on oral tradition, which is a fancy way of saying they had killer memories. But let's not get too misty-eyed over the Druids just yet. The notion of them as all-powerful sorcerers is more fantasy than fact. Sure, they were wise and held significant influence, but they weren't pulling rabbits out of hats or casting lightning bolts. They were more like the spiritual consultants of the age, advising chiefs and kings on matters of religion, justice, and occasionally what not to wear to the next tribal gathering. The Celts themselves were organized into tribes, each with its own chief or king. This wasn't exactly a democracy, more like a monarchy with a touch of chaos. Tribal chiefs held the power, but the Druids were the ones whispering in their ears. It's like having a celebrity with a really persuasive agent. The Druids could sway the decisions of kings, not through magic, but through wisdom and knowledge. Their influence was rooted in respect and a little bit of awe. After all, who wouldn't be impressed by someone who could recite entire histories from memory? Now, let's talk about the Hollywood image of Druids. Picture the scene. A misty forest, a mysterious figure shrouded in robes, chanting incantations as lightning flashes. It's all very dramatic and very, well, wrong. The real Druids were more likely to be found leading rituals to honor nature, not summoning storms. Their rituals were deeply tied to the natural world, celebrating the changing seasons and the cycles of life and death. They were essentially the original environmentalists, long before it was cool. So why does the myth of the all-powerful Druid persist? It's simple. We love a good story. The idea of mysterious, magical figures hidden in ancient forests captivates the imagination. It's the same reason we're drawn to tales of wizards and witches. But the truth is, the Druids' real magic lay in their knowledge and their ability to guide and influence their society. They were part of a complex social structure that allowed the Celts to thrive across Europe. In wrapping up this Celtic primer, let's remember that the Druids were more than just the sum of their myths. They were a crucial part of a society that spanned continents and centuries. The real story of the Druids is one of intellect, influence, and an understanding of the natural world that still resonates today. So next time someone mentions Druids, you can nod knowingly and say, "Ah, yes, the original influencers." Ah, the Druids, those ancient influencers who could convince a king to plant trees instead of chopping off heads. But let's dive deeper into what really put the ritual in ritualistic nature worship. Spoiler alert, it wasn't about hocus pocus, but more about hocus praxis. The Druids were masters of ceremonies, orchestrating events with more precision than a modern-day wedding planner on a caffeine high. First, we have the seasonal festivals, because why not throw a party when the sun decides to switch its game? The Celts had 4 major ones: Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh. Each of these was not just an excuse to get the tribe together for a good old-fashioned bonfire, but had serious agricultural and spiritual implications. Samhain, for example, marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, a time when the veil between the living and the dead was believed to be thinnest. Talk about a killer Halloween party. But it wasn't all about ghosts and ghoulies. Archaeological evidence suggests that Samhain was a time for stock-taking and preparing for the lean months ahead. It was a practical ritual wrapped in a supernatural bow. Imbolc, celebrated around February 1st, was all about welcoming the first signs of spring. Think of it as ancient Groundhog Day, but with fewer top hats and more ritual fires. The Druids would lead ceremonies to honor Brigid, the goddess of fertility, which sounds a lot like an ancient pep rally for the crops. Beltane, on May 1st, was the carnival of fertility, complete with maypoles and presumably a fair amount of frolicking. The Druids saw this as a time to protect livestock and encourage growth, both in the fields and elsewhere. Lughnasadh, around August 1st, celebrated the first harvest. It was named after the god Lugh, who wasn't just a pretty face. He was a craftsman, warrior, and king. This festival was like a cross between a county fair and a family reunion, with athletic competitions, feasting, and even marriage contracts being settled. It was also a time for the Druids to practice some early form of conflict resolution, settling disputes that could otherwise ruin the harvest vibe. Now, let's talk rites of passage. If you've ever been to a high school graduation, you've got the basic idea. The Celts marked significant life events with ceremonies overseen by the Druids, from birth to adulthood to death. For instance, when a child was born, the Druids would perform a naming ceremony, an ancient version of a baby's shower, minus the onesies and diaper cakes. The transition from childhood to adulthood was also marked with a ritual, often involving feats of endurance or bravery. Picture an Iron Age bar mitzvah, if you will. Death, however, was where the Druids really got their robes in a twist. Funerals were elaborate affairs, more akin to a send-off party for an epic journey. Archaeological finds, like those at the famous Hallstatt cemetery in Austria, reveal graves filled with personal items, food, and weapons, indicating a belief in an afterlife where you might need your favorite sword. The Druids would conduct these rites with a solemnity befitting the occasion, guiding the soul to the other world with chants and offerings. But let's not romanticize too much. While the Druids were busy planning these grandiose events, it wasn't all sunshine and spiritual guidance. Organizing these festivals and rituals was a logistical nightmare. Imagine coordinating a festival for an entire tribe without the help of Google Calendar or a PA system. The Druids had to rely on their memory and authority to ensure everyone showed up at the right sacred grove at the right time. And just like today, there were always those who didn't RSVP, but showed up anyway, expecting free food and a good time. The romanticized image of Druids whispering ancient secrets under the light of a full moon is as appealing as it is misleading. Their rituals were deeply tied to the practical needs of their society. The festivals marked critical points in the agricultural calendar, ensuring that the community was in sync with nature's rhythms. They provided a framework for social order, reinforcing the bonds within the tribe. The rites of passage helped to define roles and responsibilities, preparing individuals for their part in the ever-spinning wheel of Celtic life. But why does the myth of the mystical, all-powerful Druid persist? Simply put, we love a good yarn. The image of a wise, enigmatic figure with a direct line to the gods is far more entertaining than the reality of an overworked event planner with a penchant for oral tradition. Yet, the true magic of the Druids lay not in their ability to conjure lightning bolts, but in their understanding of human nature and the natural world. They were the architects of a society that thrived in harmony with its environment, and their legacy is one of intellect and insight rather than incantations. As we wrap up this portion of our Celtic journey, let's tip our hats to the Druids, not as mythical wizards, but as the masterful conductors of the grand orchestra of life and death. They orchestrated the rituals that stitched the fabric of Celtic society, ensuring that the music of the seasons, the cycles of life, played on in harmonious rhythm. And as we leave this chapter open, let's keep in mind that the story of the Druids is far from over. There's still much more to uncover about these ancient influencers and their role in the tapestry of history. And so, the curtain rises again on our Celtic stage, with the Druids playing a role more complex than any Shakespearean plot twist. We turn our gaze now to the sacred sites that formed the backbone of Druidic practice, places like Stonehenge, which, contrary to popular belief, wasn't just an ancient meeting spot for time-traveling tourists. These sites were the beating heart of Celtic spirituality, where nature and myth intertwined in a dance as old as time itself. Let's start with Stonehenge, the rock star of prehistoric monuments. Built around 2500 BCE, it predates even the earliest known references to the Druids. Yet, by the time the Druids were doing their thing, Stonehenge was already ancient history. This didn't stop them from possibly using it as a stage for their celestial concerts. The alignment of the stones with the solstices turned the site into an astronomical observatory of sorts, perfect for a society that celebrated the cycles of the sun and moon with more enthusiasm than a solar-powered disco. But here's the kicker. Stonehenge wasn't built by the Celts. It's like crediting the construction of the Great Wall to your neighborhood handyman. The builders of Stonehenge were the Neolithic people, those early farmers who probably didn't foresee their work becoming the subject of Instagram posts millennia later. Yet, the Druids, ever the savvy spiritual marketers, might have commandeered this megalithic marvel to enhance their own rituals. Imagine the logistical nightmare of coordinating a gathering there without so much as a megaphone. Thousands would trek from across the region, not just for spiritual enlightenment, but also for a bit of old-fashioned networking. It was like an ancient TED talk with a mystical twist. And let's not forget other sacred sites scattered across the Celtic world. The Hill of Tara in Ireland, for instance, was no mere hill, but a seat of kingship and ritual. Here, Druids might have conducted their earth and sky ceremonies, using the natural landscape as both stage and script. The connection between the Druids and these sites reveals a deep-seated reverence for the natural world, a belief that the land itself was imbued with spiritual power. This wasn't just about hugging trees. It was about tapping into an energy they believed flowed through every rock and stream. But let's shift gears and talk logistics, because orchestrating gatherings of this scale was no small feat. Picture trying to organize Coachella, but without cell phones or porta parties. Economic impact was significant. Resources had to be gathered, food prepared, and accommodations arranged for those who traveled. It wasn't just about spirituality. It was an economic boon, akin to hosting the Olympic Games. Local tribes could trade goods, settle disputes, and forge alliances. These events were as much about politics and economy as they were about worship. Speaking of worship, let's address the elephant, or rather the human, sacrifice in the room. Tales of the Druids engaging in human sacrifice are as juicy as they are often exaggerated. Roman writers, particularly Julius Caesar, had a penchant for painting the Celts as barbaric, perhaps to justify Roman conquests. Caesar wasn't exactly a neutral party, more like a PR agent with an agenda. He claimed the Druids burned people alive in massive wicker figures, a scene as chilling as it is compelling. But archaeological evidence for such practices is scarce, and what we do find suggests that if sacrifices happened, they were the exception, not the rule. The myth of human sacrifice tells us more about Roman propaganda than about Celtic reality. It reveals the Roman need to portray their enemies as savages in need of civilization. It's a tale as old as empire, dehumanized to dominate. But if we strip away the sensationalism, we find a society deeply attuned to the natural and spiritual worlds, using rituals to maintain balance and order. However, the allure of the macabre persists. The image of Druids conducting dark rites in the glow of a bonfire captures the imagination, even if it distorts the truth. The reality was likely more mundane. Sacrifices, if they occurred, might have been more symbolic, involving animals or offerings of goods. It was about appeasing the gods and ensuring the community's prosperity, less about reveling in gore. The Celts believed in a world where the lines between the living and the divine were as thin as a Celtic knot. Life, death, and the afterlife were not distinct realms, but a continuous cycle. This worldview was reflected in their rituals and their reverence for sacred sites. It's a perspective that saw the cosmos as interconnected, with humanity playing its part in a grand cosmic dance. As we meander through the mists of Celtic history, it's worth remembering that the Druids were more than the sum of their myths. They were the intellectual and spiritual backbone of a society that thrived on its connection to the natural world. Their practices, while often shrouded in mystery, were a reflection of their understanding of life's rhythms and the universe's vastness. The truth, as always, is somewhere between the legend and the archaeological record, a space as intriguing as it is elusive. So, as we leave this chapter open, let's not just stand in awe of the Druids' legendary status. Let's also appreciate the very real role they played in shaping Celtic society. They were the conductors of a cultural symphony, their influence resonating through time like a timeless melody. And as we continue to unravel their story, we'll find that the echoes of their world still reverberate in ours. Let's keep that thought in our back pocket as we venture further into the Celtic twilight. The curtain falls on the Druids as mystical maestros, but as history proves, every act must face its final bow. Enter the Romans, marching in like an uninvited guest at a wedding, ready to turn the Druids' world upside down. This wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a seismic shift that would make the San Andreas fault blush. The Roman conquest of Celtic lands was less about cultural exchange and more about asserting dominance. Think less, let's share some recipes, and more, we're taking your lunch. Julius Caesar, with his ambitious ego nearly as massive as his armies, saw the Celts as an obstacle to Rome's expansion. His Gallic wars, 5850 BCE, were not just about gaining territory, but also about neutralizing the Druids' influence, which he perceived as the glue holding Celtic society together. Caesar's accounts, while rich in detail, were as unbiased as a tabloid headline. He spun tales of Druids conducting human sacrifices, painting them as barbaric priests to justify his conquests. You've got to admire his dedication to PR, even if his stories were as reliable as a three-legged chair. As the Romans steamrolled through Gaul and into the British Isles, they set their sights on dismantling the Druids' power base. The strategy was as ruthless as it was effective. Target the leaders to weaken the followers. The Druids, with their knowledge and influence, were seen as the brains of the Celtic operation. So, Rome did what any empire would do when faced with a pesky intellectual elite. They outlawed them. This wasn't just about erasing a religious caste. It was a calculated move to disrupt the entire Celtic social structure. Fast forward to 60 or 61 CE, when the Romans launched their infamous assault on the island of Anglesey, known back then as Mona. This wasn't a casual day trip. It was a full-scale military operation aimed at the heart of Druidic power. The historian Tacitus describes the scene with all the drama of a Hollywood blockbuster. Druids standing on the shore, arms raised, hurling curses as Roman soldiers advanced. It was a clash of civilizations where spiritual defiance met military might, and spoiler alert, the guys with the swords usually win. The fall of Anglesey marked the beginning of the end for the Druids. Their sacred groves were destroyed, their influence dismantled, and their role in society diminished. Like any good tale of rise and fall, the Druids' story didn't end there. If anything, their decline only added fuel to the myth-making fire. As Christianity swept through the British Isles from the 4th century onward, the Druids found themselves recast in a new narrative, often as the pagan villains, in need of conversion, or as mystical figures of a bygone age. Christian monks, with their own brand of storytelling flair, began to document the history of the Celts, but their accounts were often less historical record and more moral fable, casting the Druids as sorcerers and heathens. It's as if the Druids had been reborn in the medieval imagination as the ultimate boogeymen, lurking in the shadows of history. Yet, this vilification also contributed to their enduring legacy. The allure of the mysterious, of the misunderstood, is as potent as any truth. The Druids' transformation into cultural icons is a testament to the power of myth. By the time the Romantic movement rolled around in the 18th and 19th centuries, Druids were being reimagined yet again, this time as wise sages connected to nature, the kind of figures you'd find dispensing wisdom in a Tolkien novel. The Druids were back, not as priests, but as symbols of a lost connection with the natural world. It was a revival that said more about the Romantics' yearning for nature than about historical reality. But hey, never let facts get in the way of a good story. The Druids' legacy, then, is a patchwork of history, myth, and reinvention. Their story is one of intellectual and spiritual power disrupted by conquest, yet preserved through the very myths that sought to destroy them. It's a tale of how narratives are shaped, twisted, and retold through the ages. They went from feared priests to vilified heretics to cultural icons, proving that in history, as in fashion, what's old can become new again. As we pause in this saga of the Druids, it's clear that their influence, though diminished, never truly disappeared. The echoes of their chants, the shadows of their rituals, and the whispers of their wisdom still reverberate in the corridors of history. But hold that thought, because just like any good series, there's always another episode waiting in the wings, ready to unravel more of the Druids' enduring enigma. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in this ancient tale promises even more twists and turns on the path through the mists of time. As the curtain of history pulls back one last time on the Druids, we find ourselves face to face with a peculiar modern paradox. While the ancient Druids were all but obliterated by the Romans, their legacy has been resurrected in the vibrant tapestry of modern spirituality. It's as if they've been cast in the role of nature's original gurus, making a comeback more legendary than an 80s rock band reunion tour. But how did these ancient figures transform from historical footnotes to the poster children of contemporary mysticism? Spoiler alert. It involves a dash of romanticism, a sprinkle of New Age charm, and a whole lot of cultural reinterpretation. Let's rewind to the 18th century, when the Druids began their unexpected revival. This was a time when the Romantics, with their love for all things wild and untamed, rediscovered the Celts and their enigmatic priests. They saw the Druids not as barbaric priests, but as noble savages, wise sages who lived in harmony with nature. It was an image straight out of a pastoral painting, albeit one that was more fantasy than fact. The Romantics were as skilled at myth-making as the ancient storytellers they admired. They romanticized the Druids into figures of lost wisdom, conveniently overlooking the lack of concrete evidence to support such idealized views. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the Druids find themselves caught in the whirlwind of New Age spirituality. This era, with its penchant for blending ancient traditions with modern beliefs, embraced the Druids as symbols of a mystical past. Suddenly, Druidic rituals were being reimagined with crystals, tarot cards, and meditation, creating a spiritual smoothie that was more New Age than Iron Age. It's a colorful reinterpretation, but one that often cherry-picks elements that fit modern sensibilities while leaving the more inconvenient truths, like the Romans' less than favorable accounts, on the cutting room floor. The core of this modern fascination lies in the Druids' perceived connection to nature. In an increasingly complex and technology-driven world, the idea of living in harmony with the earth has undeniable appeal. The Druids, with their sacred groves and seasonal festivals, embody a simpler, more connected way of life. And who wouldn't want to escape the chaos of the digital age for a serene circle of standing stones. It's a romantic notion that taps into a universal yearning for meaning and balance in a world that often feels out of sync. But let's not get carried away with the fairy dust just yet. The modern Druidic movement, while inspired by ancient practices, is more of a reinvention than a revival. Groups like the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, founded in 1964, have crafted a spiritual path that resonates with contemporary seekers. They've taken the fragments of history and woven them into a spiritual practice that emphasizes personal growth, community, and environmental stewardship. It's a creative endeavor that owes as much to 20th century philosophy as it does to ancient lore, illustrating how the past can be reshaped to suit the needs of the present. This modern iteration of Druidry is less about historical accuracy and more about the values it represents. It offers a sense of continuity with the past, even if that past is more imagined than real. It's a reminder that history is not just a record of what was, but a canvas for what could be. The Druids, as reconstructed by modern movements, serve as a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary ideals, offering a framework for living in a way that respects both tradition and innovation. Yet, the appeal of the Druids isn't solely confined to the spiritual realm. Their image has permeated popular culture, from literature to film. Whether it's in the pages of fantasy novels or the scenes of epic blockbusters, Druids are often depicted as wise mentors or mysterious figures, wielding powers that blend magic and nature. It's a portrayal that owes more to imagination than archaeology, but one that captivates audiences all the same. This cultural fascination speaks to a broader human desire for stories that transcend the ordinary, for tales that blend the mystical with the mundane. So, what does this enduring fascination with the Druids reveal about us? At its core, it's a reflection of our own quest for meaning in a world that often feels disconnected from the natural rhythms of life. The Druids, with their ancient rites and reverence for nature, offer an idealized vision of a world where humanity and the environment are in harmony. It's a vision that resonates in an age marked by environmental challenges and existential uncertainties. As we conclude this journey through the mists of time, let's acknowledge the Druids for what they truly were, complex figures who straddled the line between myth and reality. Their story is one of survival, not just through the ages, but through the narratives that have kept their legacy alive. In the end, the Druids remind us that history is not just a chronicle of events, but a living dialogue between past and present. Their legacy, like the ancient stones they may have once gathered around, stands as a testament to the enduring power of myth and the human desire to connect with something greater than ourselves. And so, the curtain finally falls on our Celtic odyssey, leaving us with the timeless echoes of Druidic chants and the whisper of ancient trees. As we step back into our own world, perhaps we carry with us a touch of their wisdom, a reminder that the past, with all its mysteries and myths, still shapes the stories we tell today. In the bustling realm of history's greatest empires, the Incas have a rather unique address. Nestled high in the Andes, the Inca Empire wasn't just about high-altitude living. It was about mastering a world where the air is thin and the mountains are anything but forgiving. Think of the Andes as the world's most dramatic stage, where the Incas put on a show of imperial prowess that left the rest of the pre-Columbian world catching their breath, literally. So, who gets the credit for this high-altitude success story? Enter Pachacuti, the empire's founding father and a guy who could turn a good expansion strategy into an art form. Born in 1418, Pachacuti came to power in the 1430 with the kind of ambition that could move mountains, or at least conquer them. By the time he was done, he hadn't just built an empire. He had orchestrated the transformation of Cusco from a quaint city-state into the heart of an empire that spanned 500 miles of rugged terrain. That's like taking a road trip from New York to San Francisco, only without the comforting presence of gas stations or GPS. Pachacuti didn't just wake up one day and decide to be king of the hills. He was a man of vision, and his strategy wasn't just about waving swords around. First, he fortified Cusco, creating a capital that could withstand both time and the odd rebellious neighbor. His system of expansion was more about diplomacy and less about decapitation. He understood that you catch more flies with honey than with war axes. Pachacuti would often send emissaries to neighboring regions with gifts and promises of alliance. If you're thinking political savvy meets high-stakes poker, you're spot on. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the romance of diplomacy. When persuasion failed, Pachacuti was not above using good old-fashioned conquest. Take the kingdom of Chanka, for instance. Legend has it that Pachacuti, with his back against the wall, rallied the troops with such zeal that even the stones supposedly rose to fight. While the idea of rock-solid reinforcements is a bit of a stretch, it certainly makes for a great story. And in the end, the Chanka were defeated, and Pachacuti's legend was cemented in stone, literally and figuratively. Now, let's talk infrastructure, because what's an empire without some serious roads? The Incas built a network of roads that would make modern urban planners drool. We're talking about 25,000 miles of pathways snaking through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, without a single backhoe or bulldozer in sight. These roads weren't just for show. They were the arteries of the empire, enabling communication, trade, and military movements with efficiency that would make even FedEx blush. And they did it all without Google Maps. Imagine coordinating a network like that today with just a llama and some yarn. Their engineering prowess didn't stop at roads. The Incas also perfected a communication system known as the chasqui, a relay of runners who could transport messages faster than you could say Pachacuti. These guys were the equivalent of high-speed internet, sprinting across mountain passes to deliver news and orders. It's said that a message could move at a rate of 150 miles per day, impressive for a time when the cutting edge of communication was otherwise a smoke signal. But let's not romanticize it too much. The chasqui were essentially the empire's Wi-Fi, and just like your current service provider, came with their own set of issues, like exhaustion and the occasional mountain lion. Still, this system was a testament to the Incas' ability to innovate under pressure, turning the harsh realities of their geography into a functioning network that kept the empire humming. The Incas' ability to thrive in the Andes wasn't just about building roads and running marathons. Their agricultural innovations were just as impressive. Terracing allowed them to transform steep slopes into arable land, a feat that ensured food security in a landscape that looked more suited to mountain goats than cornfields. They cultivated a staggering variety of crops, adapting them to different altitudes like a botanical version of Tetris. Thanks to these innovations, the Incas could support a population of up to 10 million people, a testament to their mastery of both the land and the art of survival. The Inca Empire, at its peak, was a marvel of organization and efficiency, a testament to what can be achieved when human ingenuity meets natural adversity. But before we get too wrapped up in the majesty of it all, let's remember that this was an empire built on the backs of its people, where labor was compulsory and hierarchy was as steep as the mountains themselves. The Incas may have been masters of their domain, but their society was a rigid one, with a social structure as unforgiving as the Andean peaks. Still, there's no denying that the Incas left an indelible mark on history. Their empire was a feat of human achievement, a high-altitude testament to the power of vision, innovation, and more than a little tenacity. As we delve deeper into their story, remember that the Andes were both their greatest challenge and their strongest ally, a mountain range that stood as both a barrier and a backbone to one of history's most impressive empires. The Andes were both their greatest challenge and their strongest ally, a mountain range that stood as both a barrier and a backbone to one of history's most impressive empires. Let's take a closer look at how the Incas managed to keep their empire running as smoothly as a well-oiled llama cart. Enter the Inca bureaucracy, a system so centralized it makes your average office hierarchy look like a laid-back beach party. Imagine a society where every action, from planting potatoes to planning parades, was orchestrated by the state. The Incas had a knack for organization that would make even a Swiss watchmaker blush. At the top of this well-structured pyramid stood the Sapa Inca, the emperor himself, who enjoyed a lifestyle that would rival any modern-day celebrity. The term Sapa Inca translates to the only Inca, which gives you a pretty good idea of how he saw himself: unique, indispensable, and completely in charge. Ruling from the city of Cusco, the Sapa Inca was viewed as a divine figure, a living god whose word was as good as gold, or at least as good as a solid gold llama statuette. His authority was absolute, and he wielded it with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing that the sun god in Thai was supposedly on speed dial. But let's not get too starry-eyed about the Sapa Inca's celestial endorsement. His divine status served a very earthly purpose: control. By positioning himself as a guard king, the Sapa Inca ensured the loyalty of his subjects, who believed that disobedience could bring about divine wrath, or at least a stern talking to. This blend of religion and governance was as brilliant as it was convenient, ensuring a smooth flow of power right from the heavens down to the humblest of huts. Now, you might be thinking that this sounds like a pretty sweet setup for the Sapa Inca, and you'd be right, but maintaining such an extensive empire meant that the Sapa Inca couldn't do it all himself. Enter the nobles, a group whose job was to make sure the empire's wheels kept turning without too many bumps in the road. These nobles were like the Inca Empire's middle management, responsible for everything from tax collection to overseeing construction projects. They were trusted allies, often relatives, who were granted land and privileges in exchange for their service. It was a classic case of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, albeit with a bit more gold and a lot more responsibility. Speaking of responsibilities, let's talk about the meter system, an ingenious yet demanding form of labor tax that the Incas used to keep their empire running. The meter required adult males to devote a certain portion of their time each year to state projects, whether that meant building roads, working in mines, or serving in the military. Imagine a world where your civic duty involved less paperwork and a lot more pickaxes. In return for their labor, workers were provided with food, clothing, and other essentials, a system that ensured everyone contributed to the common good. It was like a giant, mandatory company retreat, but instead of trust falls, you got to enjoy the thrill of constructing a stone fortress. But before you start imagining this as a utopian society where everyone happily chipped in, let's inject a dose of reality. The meter system was compulsory, and failure to show up for your assigned labor could result in severe punishment. This wasn't a volunteer gig, it was an obligation, and one that could take a significant toll on families left without their primary breadwinner. The Incas may have called it communal work, but for many, it was a heavy burden. And while the system did ensure the completion of massive infrastructure projects and the smooth operation of the empire, it was also a tool of control, ensuring that no one strayed too far from the state's watchful eye. Despite its demands, the meter system was remarkably effective. It enabled the Inca Empire to achieve feats of engineering that still boggle the mind today. Consider Machu Picchu, the iconic site perched high in the Andes, which was likely constructed by workers fulfilling their meter obligations. The sheer scale and precision of such projects are a testament to what can be achieved when human labor is harnessed with the precision of a Swiss Army knife. But let's not gloss over the fact that this precision was often achieved through sheer force and the looming threat of retribution. In the grand scheme of things, the Incas' centralized bureaucracy was both their strength and their Achilles' heel. While it allowed for efficient administration and the execution of grand projects, it also relied on a rigid social structure that left little room for personal freedom. This was no democracy, and while modern myths might paint the Inca Empire as a harmonious society, the truth is far more complex. Hierarchies were steep, and those at the bottom often bore the brunt of the burdens imposed by those at the top. The idea of the Inca Empire as a utopia is as appealing as it is inaccurate. Sure, they had impressive public works and a seemingly cohesive society, but they also had a system of control that ensured everyone knew their place. It was a society built on order and obedience, where deviation from the norm was not just discouraged, but actively punished. In this sense, the Inca Empire was like a finely tuned orchestra, where every note was meticulously planned, and deviations were met with the conductor's stern gaze. As we continue to explore the intricacies of Incan society, remember that behind the golden facades and architectural marvels lay a society as complex and multifaceted as any other. The Incas were masters of their environment and their people, wielding power with both grace and a hefty dose of pragmatism. Their story is one of ambition and achievement, but also of control and constraint. And as we delve further into the annals of their history, it's clear that the empire was anything but a simple high-altitude paradise. Stay tuned, because there's much more to uncover about these masters of the Andes and the legacy they left in their stone-carved wake. Now, as we dig into the Inca economic engine, prepare to be dazzled by a system that would make even modern economists swoon. Imagine an empire without coins jingling in pockets or checks being scribbled in a hurry. That's right, the Inca Empire, with its sprawling 500-mile stretch, ran smoothly without a single minted currency. Instead, it thrived on a barter-based economy, a concept that might seem as out of place today as a flip phone at a tech convention. Let's start with their agricultural innovations, because in the Inca world, agriculture wasn't just a way to fill stomachs, it was the backbone of the economy. Terrace farming, their piece de resistance, transformed the vertiginous Andes into a patchwork quilt of arable land. These terraces didn't just look pretty, they were an engineering marvel, designed to maximize the use of limited resources like water and soil. By building stone walls to create flat fields on slopes, the Incas ingeniously prevented erosion and made the most of the sun's warmth. It's like turning a mountain into a layered cake, where each tier is a different flavor of crop. The Incas cultivated over 70 different crops, including staples like maize, potatoes, and quinoa, long before it became the darling of health food bloggers everywhere. Their farming methods ensured food security for a population that could top 10 million, all without the help of a single drive-through. Think about that the next time you're stuck in line waiting for your burger while contemplating global food shortages. The Incas didn't have the luxury of fast food, but they sure had fastidious farming. But what about trade, you ask? The Incas took a leaf out of the sharing is caring playbook. Trade was conducted through a complex system of reciprocity, where goods and services were exchanged without the need for money. Picture this. Instead of swiping a credit card, you might trade a basket of maize for a finely woven textile. It's like a perpetual community swap meet, but without the haggling over whether that vase really matches the couch. Now, you might be wondering how they kept track of all these exchanges. Enter the quipu, a series of knotted strings that functioned as an ancient spreadsheet, recording everything from crop yields to labor obligations. These knotted cords were the Inca answer to data analytics, proving that sometimes the simplest tools are the most effective. They were the original cloud storage. Only this cloud was made of wool and hung around the necks of the empire's administrators. What really sets the Inca economy apart is its sense of community and redistribution. The state took on the role of chief organizer, ensuring that resources were distributed where they were needed most. In a way, the empire functioned like a massive, centrally planned co-op, with goods flowing from areas of surplus to those of scarcity. A drought in one region didn't mean starvation, as the state's storehouses could be tapped to provide for those in need. It's a bit like the ultimate potluck dinner, where everyone contributes what they have, and nobody goes home hungry. This system of redistribution was managed through a network of storehouses called calcas, strategically positioned along the empire's extensive road network. These storehouses were stocked with everything from dried meat to freeze-dried potatoes. Yes, freeze-drying isn't just a modern miracle. The Incas mastered it centuries ago, using the natural freeze-thaw cycle of the Andes to preserve food for long-term storage. These calcas were the ancient equivalent of Amazon warehouses, only instead of next-day delivery, you had to factor in travel time by llama. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the llama. The absence of a currency system might seem like an insurmountable hurdle, but for the Incas, it was actually a strategic advantage. Without reliance on currency, their economy was less susceptible to the pitfalls of inflation or market crashes. True, bartering required a bit more logistical finesse, but it also meant that the economy was grounded in tangible goods and services, rather than abstract numbers on a ledger. It's a system that might just make a case for the power of simplicity in an age of financial complexity. But before we get too sentimental about this cash-free economy, let's not overlook the rigid control that made it possible. While goods flowed freely, the system was underpinned by the state's watchful eye, ensuring that every potato and poncho was accounted for. The Sapa Inca's reach extended into the very fields and homes of his subjects, with the economy serving as yet another tool of control. It was efficient, yes, but also inescapably authoritarian. So, While the Inca economy might sound like an idyllic example of communal cooperation, it was also a reflection of a society where personal freedom was often sacrificed on the altar of state efficiency. The Incas managed to feed millions and build architectural wonders without the crutch of currency, but it came at the cost of individual autonomy. As we peel back the layers of this high-altitude empire, it's clear that their success was as much about control as it was about community. It's a duality that echoes through history, reminding us that the past is never as simple as it seems. And with that, we'll leave the story suspended in the Andes air, ready to delve deeper into the intricate dance of Inca society in our next chapter. As we find ourselves perched on the brink of yet another Incan enigma, let's swivel our gaze from economics and delve into the spiritual heart of this mountain empire. If the Inca economy was a well-oiled machine of barter and bureaucracy, their religious life was the vibrant tapestry that wove meaning into the daily grind. This was a culture where the divine was as omnipresent as the Andes themselves, a land where gods roamed freely, and the heavens were just a llama's leap away. Now, when it comes to Inca religion, let's start with the VIP of the celestial realm, Inti, the sun god. Inti wasn't just a bright spot in the sky. He was the superstar of Inca pantheon, the celestial CEO, if you will. Picture this: the Sapa Inca, who was considered Inti's earthly emissary, standing under the blazing sun, feeling like he had the ultimate endorsement deal. The sun wasn't just a source of light, but the very essence of life, warmth, and prosperity. Without Inti, there would be no crops, no warmth, and most importantly, no empire. The sun god's influence wasn't a casual affair. It was woven into the very fabric of Inca society. The annual Inti Raymi festival was the high point of the Inca calendar, a 9-day extravaganza of rituals, music, and dancing that left no stone unturned, literally, if you consider their penchant for impressive stonework. Held in Cusco, the heart of the empire, this festival wasn't just a sun-soaked party. It was a reaffirmation of the bond between the Inca and their divine benefactor. Imagine thousands gathering in the plaza, decked out in their finest, offering sacrifices, not human, mind you, but llamas and guinea pigs, the latter being perhaps a less appetizing version of a carco vin. Speaking of sacrifices, let's debunk one of the most persistent myths about the Incas, the legend of rampant human sacrifices. Sure, there's a grim allure to tales of blood-soaked altars and terrified victims, but the truth is, human sacrifice was not the norm. It was an exception, reserved for extreme circumstances, like natural disasters or the death of a Sapa Inca. Even then, the chosen ones, often children, were treated with reverence, believed to join the gods in a sacred afterlife. It's a far cry from the gory spectacles Hollywood would have us believe, but hey, a little drama never hurt a box office, right? Now, let's get real about the myth of El Dorado, the legendary city of gold that has tantalized treasure hunters for centuries. The Incas did have a thing for gold, lots of it. To them, gold was the sweat of the sun, a sacred material used to adorn temples and craft exquisite artifacts. But the idea of entire cities paved with the stuff, pure fantasy. The Spanish conquistadors, fueled by greed and a flair for hyperbole, spun tales of golden cities to justify their relentless plundering. Spoiler alert, they never found it. Instead, they encountered meticulously organized cities like Cusco, which, while impressive, were more about stone and sweat than gold-plated opulence. Of course, the Incas did leave behind a legacy of gold work that dazzled even the most jaded of European explorers. From intricate jewelry to sun discs that radiated divine energy, these artifacts were symbols of power and piety. But let's not kid ourselves. Their gold wasn't just for show. It was a political tool, a way to showcase the empire's wealth and ensure loyalty among the nobility. It's like modern-day billionaires flaunting their yachts and private islands, only with a bit more religious reverence and a lot less Instagram. As we dig deeper into the rich soil of Inca spirituality, it becomes clear that this was a society where religion and governance were as intertwined as vines on an Andean slope. The Sapa Inca, as the son of the sun, wielded both temporal and spiritual power, a dual role that kept the state running smoother than a finely tuned chasqui relay. This divine mandate wasn't just a perk. It was a strategic necessity, a way to maintain order and unity in an empire that stretched over mountains and across valleys. And let's not forget the other deities in the Inca pantheon, each with their own domain and devotees. There was Viracocha, the creator god who, according to legend, fashioned humanity from stone. Then there was Pachamama, the Earth Mother, revered in agricultural rituals that ensured bountiful harvests. Her role was so integral that even today, Andean communities offer her gifts of coca leaves and chicha, a corn-based brew that packs a punch worthy of any happy hour. Yet, despite the pantheon's diversity, Intai's supremacy was unquestionable. His influence was so pervasive that even the architecture of Cusco paid homage to the sun. The Coricancha, or Temple of the Sun, was the most sacred site of the empire, a place where walls once gleamed with gold and priests performed daily rites to honor Intai. When the Spanish arrived, their jaws probably hit the floor faster than the gold did into their plundering hands. Today, the remnants of this temple lie beneath the colonial church of Santo Domingo, a juxtaposition that speaks volumes about the clash of cultures and the relentless march of history. As we weave through the vibrant threads of Inca culture, it's clear that their religious life was both a foundation and a fortress, a way to bind people together with a common purpose and a shared destiny. It was a society where the divine was ever present, where every action, from planting seeds to building temples, was an offering to the gods. And while myths of golden cities and sacrificial altars persist, the reality is far richer, a testament to human ingenuity, faith, and the eternal quest for meaning in a world as unforgiving as the Andean peaks. But don't hang up your walking stick just yet. The story of the Incas is as layered as their terraces, and there's much more to uncover in the saga of these Andean architects of empire. As we continue our journey into the heart of Inca society, remember that behind the myths and the mysteries lies a civilization that was as complex and captivating as any in history. Stay tuned, because the peaks and valleys of this tale are far from over. And so, dear listeners, we find ourselves at the precipice of one of history's most dramatic downfalls, where the Inca Empire, once as sturdy as its stonework, suddenly found itself teetering like a Jenga tower with one too many pieces pulled. Enter Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror with a knack for turning up uninvited and leaving a trail of chaos that would make even the most melodramatic soap opera look like a Sunday picnic. Let's set the scene. It's the early 16th century, and the Spanish are on a roll. They've got an appetite for gold that rivals a dragon's hoard, and the New World is their buffet. Pizarro, having heard rumors of an empire so rich it practically glittered in the sun, decided to trade his retirement for a ticket to fame and fortune. Cue the ominous music, because this is where things get messy. Now, Pizarro wasn't exactly rolling in dough. His first expedition in 1524 ended with little more than a sunburn and a few mosquito bites. But persistence is a virtue, and by 1532, Pizarro returned with a slightly improved entourage. 168 men, 62 horses, and enough firepower to make the locals think the guards were having a really bad day. And let's be honest, when your weaponry includes guns and cannons, and you're up against warriors with slingshots and spears, it's hardly a fair fight. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just bullets that brought the Incas to their knees. Nope, it was a microscopic army, far more ruthless and indiscriminate. Smallpox, that invisible invader, had already blazed through the empire before Pizarro even set foot on Inca soil. With a mortality rate that could put modern pandemics to shame, smallpox did more to weaken the Inca Empire than any sword or musket ever could. It's estimated that up to 90% of the population succumbed to diseases brought by Europeans. To the Incas, these illnesses must have seemed like a curse from the gods, a cruel irony considering their deep religious ties. Now, if you're wondering how Pizarro managed to capture the Inca Emperor Atahualpa with such a small force, the answer lies in a mix of bravado, betrayal, and just plain audacity. Atahualpa, fresh off a civil war victory against his brother Huascar, was lured into a meeting with Pizarro, perhaps thinking it was just another diplomatic chit-chat. Instead, he found himself the star of a high-stakes hostage drama. The Spanish demanded a ransom that would make any Wall Street banker blush, a room filled with gold and another two with silver. The Incas, bless their trusting hearts, delivered. But spoiler alert, a fortune in precious metals couldn't buy Atahualpa's freedom. He was executed in 1533, marking a chilling turning point. The Spanish conquest wasn't just a military triumph, it was an economic takeover. They seized the Inca road system, plundered its storehouses, and systematically dismantled the centralized economy that had sustained the empire for decades. The meter system, which once ensured communal prosperity, was twisted into a tool of exploitation, fueling the Spanish appetite for wealth. It was capitalism in its earliest and most ruthless form, and the Incas found themselves at the sharp end of the bargain. As the dust settled, the once mighty empire crumbled into a patchwork of Spanish strongholds and indigenous resistance. The Incas' sophisticated society, with its rich cultural tapestry, was reduced to a footnote in the Spanish annals of conquest. But history, like the Andes, is full of peaks and valleys. The legacy of the Incas didn't vanish with the last quipu or the final breath of a Sapa Inca. Fast forward to today, where the Inca legacy is both celebrated and misunderstood. Machu Picchu, the enigmatic city in the clouds, stands as a testament to their architectural genius, drawing tourists like moths to a flame. Yet for many, the Inca story is shrouded in myth, overshadowed by the romantic allure of lost cities and El Dorado's golden fables. We remember the Incas as the architects of empire, but often forget the human cost, the rigid hierarchies, and the relentless control that kept the empire ticking. As we reflect on the fall of the Incas, it's crucial to question how much of their culture has been filtered through the rose-tinted glasses of colonial narratives. The Incas were a people of profound innovation, yet their story is often reduced to a backdrop for tales of Spanish bravado. In a world increasingly aware of cultural heritage, we must strive to see beyond the myths and acknowledge the complexities of their history. The Incas remind us that empires, no matter how formidable, are fragile constructs. They can rise and fall on the whims of fate, be it a conquistador's ambition or a deadly virus. Their story is a poignant reminder of the interplay between power and vulnerability, a theme as relevant today as it was in the 16th century. So, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps dreaming of sun-drenched temples and Andean vistas, remember that the Incas were more than their legends. They were a people of resilience and resourcefulness, whose legacy endures in the echoes of history and the shadows of the Andes. And with that, we bid adieu to the masters of the mountains, their story a tapestry woven with threads of triumph, tragedy, and enduring mystery. Winston Churchill, the man who would become one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century, didn't exactly burst forth from the womb with a cigar in hand and a V for victory sign. No, young Winston started his journey with a few stumbles and a whole lot of chutzpah. Born prematurely on November 30, 1874, in a bedroom at Blenheim Palace, he was hardly a child prodigy. In fact, his academic record was less than stellar, could do better than child genius. He flunked the entrance exam for Harrow twice before finally scraping through. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent politician, but young Winston was more interested in toy soldiers than textbooks. Churchill's school days were a series of misadventures. At Harrow, he was placed in the lowest division of the lowest class. Let's just say he wasn't top of the class, unless you count the number of times he got detention. Despite this, his love for the English language was already taking root. He devoured books, especially those about history and adventure, and he was known to recite whole passages of poetry by heart, much to the bemusement of his teachers. His school reports were a mix of frustration and mild admiration. One teacher famously noted, "He is a constant trouble to everybody, and is always in some scrape or other." Yet, there was something about this young misfit that hinted at a future beyond the classroom. As if his school days weren't enough of a roller coaster, Churchill's early military career was straight out of a boy's own adventure story. He applied to the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, failing the entrance exam twice before passing on the third try. Persistence, it seemed, was another of his early traits, alongside a penchant for the dramatic. Once at Sandhurst, he excelled in subjects he actually gave a hoot about, namely tactics and military history. In 1895, at the ripe age of 21, Churchill was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, a cavalry regiment that allowed him to indulge his love for all things equestrian and dashing. But the military wasn't just a playground for Churchill. It was a springboard into the political arena he so desperately wanted to enter. His first taste of real action came in 1897 on the northwest frontier of British India, a place as dangerous as its name suggests. Churchill wrote about his experiences in the Malakand Field Force with a flair that would later become his trademark. His dispatches were published in London newspapers, and he was paid a handsome sum for them, too, who said you can't mix business with pleasure. In 1899, Churchill's thirst for adventure led him to the Boer War in South Africa, where he was captured and made a spectacular escape from a POW camp. This wasn't just any jailbreak. It involved climbing over a latrine wall in the dead of night, trekking nearly 300 miles to safety, and becoming an instant celebrity. He was hailed as a hero back home, and it wasn't long before he parlayed that fame into a political career. By 1900, he had won a seat in Parliament as the Conservative member for Oldham. Not bad for a guy whose teachers once thought he'd amount to nothing more than a professional mischief maker. Churchill's early years were a whirlwind of daring escapades and relentless ambition. They were foundational in shaping the bulldog spirit that would define his later leadership. His experiences on the battlefield and in the political trenches taught him lessons no classroom ever could. He learned about leadership, resilience, and the importance of a good headline, all of which would serve him well in the tumultuous years to come. As he famously said, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." And continue he did, with unyielding resolve and more than a little panache. Churchill's path from mischievous student to political dynamo was anything but ordinary. He was a man who knew how to turn a setback into a setup for a comeback, and by the early 20th century, he was climbing the political ladder with the verve of a man who'd once escaped a POW camp by scaling a latrine wall. Having already tasted the sweetness of political success as a young MP, Churchill was eyeing bigger fish to fry. In 1904, tired of his Conservative colleagues' reluctance to embrace social reform, Churchill made a bold move. He crossed the political aisle to join the Liberal Party. Now, switching political parties might seem like social suicide for most politicians, but Churchill was anything but typical. This move wasn't just about ideology. It was a strategic leap towards greater influence and power. By 1908, he'd secured a seat as the MP for Dundee and found himself appointed as president of the Board of Trade. Here, young Winston had his first real taste of power and responsibility, and he threw himself into the role with characteristic gusto. As president of the Board of Trade, Churchill championed progressive social policies, including the establishment of labour exchanges and the introduction of unemployment insurance. He was all about tackling poverty and unemployment, issues that were as relevant then as they are today. But don't let the good intentions fool you. Churchill's efforts were also savvy political manoeuvres to build a broader base of support. He was a man who understood that winning hearts and minds often required a bit of bread and butter on the side. Fast forward to 1911, and Churchill's career took another major leap forward when he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. This was a big deal. We're talking about the guy who was now in charge of the Royal Navy, the pride of Britain, and the very backbone of its global empire. It was a role that suited Churchill's larger-than-life personality like a tailored suit. He threw himself into modernizing the fleet, pushing for the development of new battleships and the use of oil instead of coal to fuel them. This wasn't just about keeping up with the Joneses, or in this case, the Kaisers. It was about cementing Britain's naval supremacy in an increasingly turbulent world. But with great power comes great responsibility, and occasionally epic blunders. Enter the infamous Gallipoli campaign of 1915. Gallipoli. The word itself is enough to make military historians wince. The plan was audacious, a naval attack on the Dardanelles, followed by an amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The goal was to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a new front against the Central Powers. On paper, it looked like a masterstroke. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. The campaign dragged on for over 8 months, costing the Allies more than 250,000 casualties, and achieving nothing but a strategic quagmire. Churchill's role in the debacle was as controversial as the campaign itself. As one of its chief architects, he bore the brunt of the blame when things went south. Critics were quick to point fingers, accusing him of reckless ambition and poor judgment. The sting of failure was compounded by the fact that the whole affair had been a public relations disaster. It was a classic case of great idea, terrible execution. The fallout was swift and brutal. In May 1915, Churchill was effectively demoted, shuffled out of the Admiralty, and into a less influential role as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. For a man of Churchill's drive and ambition, this was a bitter pill to swallow. The press had a field day, and his political enemies rejoiced. It seemed that the golden boy of British politics had fallen from grace. Yet, as history would have it, this wasn't the end of Winston Churchill. In fact, it was merely the beginning of a new chapter. Temporarily sidelined from the political front lines, Churchill took a rather unconventional step for a disgraced politician. He returned to the military. In 1916, he joined the British Army on the Western Front, serving as a lieutenant colonel with the Royal Scots Fusiliers. While some might have seen this as a retreat, Churchill saw it as an opportunity to rebuild his reputation and connect with the soldiers on the ground. His time in the trenches offered him a first-hand glimpse of the horrors of modern warfare, an experience that would profoundly shape his views on military strategy and leadership. It was here that he honed his skills in resilience and adaptability, traits that would prove invaluable in the years to come. This grounding in the gritty realities of war did more than just rebuild Churchill's confidence. It reignited his passion for public service. By 1917, Churchill was back in the political saddle, this time as Minister of Munitions. His task was Herculean, to oversee the production of weapons and ammunition needed to sustain Britain's war effort. And boy, did he deliver. Under his watchful eye, munitions production soared, ensuring that British forces were well equipped for the bloody battles that lay ahead. Churchill's knack for organization and relentless drive were on full display, and he began to claw his way back into the good graces of his peers and the public. Yet, the spectre of Gallipoli still loomed large over his career. It was a reminder of the perils of unchecked ambition and the importance of learning from one's mistakes. Churchill, ever the pragmatist, understood that failure was not an end, a stepping stone to greater things. He once quipped, "Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm." And stumble he did, but he never lost sight of his ultimate goal, to lead his nation with courage and vision. The post-war years were a time of political recalibration for Churchill. The world was changing, and so was he. By the 1920s, he found himself back with the Conservatives, a move that raised more than a few eyebrows. But Churchill was nothing if not a political chameleon, adept at navigating the shifting sands of party politics. He was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924, a role that saw him grappling with economic challenges that would test even the most seasoned economist. Churchill's decision to return Britain to the gold standard in 1925 was controversial, to say the least. Critics argued that it overvalued the pound and stifled economic growth, while supporters hailed it as a necessary step to restore confidence in Britain's economy. Regardless of the outcome, it was a testament to Churchill's willingness to take bold, sometimes unpopular, decisions in the pursuit of what he believed was right. As the storm clouds of the 1930 began to gather, Churchill found himself increasingly at odds with his party leadership. His warnings about the rise of Nazi Germany fell on deaf ears, and he was largely marginalized within his own party. This period, often referred to as the Wilderness Years, was a time of great frustration for Churchill. But it was also a period of reflection and growth, as he honed his skills as a writer and orator, penning works that would later earn him the Nobel Prize in Literature. Through the ups and downs, Churchill's indomitable spirit and unwavering resolve never wavered. He was a man who understood that history was not just a series of events, but a tapestry woven from the choices and actions of individuals. His own life was a testament to this belief, a roller coaster of triumphs and setbacks that would eventually lead him to the pinnacle of leadership during Britain's darkest hour. But that, dear listener, is a story for another time. For now, let's leave Winston standing on the brink of greatness, a man poised to make history once again. As Churchill stood at the precipice of destiny, the world itself seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. The 1930s had been a decade of ominous rumblings, as Adolf Hitler's ambitions in Germany grew ever more menacing. By 1939, the storm had broken. The Second World War erupted, and the world was plunged into conflict once more. Britain, still reeling from the scars of the Great War, faced an existential threat. And yet, at this pivotal moment, Winston Churchill was not at the helm. He was, instead, waiting in the wings, his warnings about Nazi Germany finally resonating with a nation in dire need of resolve. Enter May 1940, a month that would change everything. The situation was dire. Nazi forces had blitzed through Western Europe, and Britain's political leadership seemed paralyzed by indecision. Enter Neville Chamberlain, the then Prime Minister, who had become synonymous with appeasement. Chamberlain's policy of placating Hitler, best symbolized by the ill-fated Munich Agreement of 1938, now looked like a diplomatic Titanic, and the iceberg had been well and truly hit. In this climate of uncertainty, Churchill's rhetoric of defiance resonated with a public desperate for leadership. On May 10, 1940, after a parliamentary vote of no confidence against Chamberlain, Winston Churchill was appointed Prime Minister. The bulldog was back, and this time he meant business. But let's not don the rose-tinted glasses just yet. For all the romanticism surrounding his ascent, Churchill faced a near-impossible task. The British Expeditionary Force was on the brink of annihilation at Dunkirk, and a Nazi invasion of Britain seemed imminent. Talk about inheriting a mess. Yet Churchill, with his indomitable spirit and flair for the dramatic, seized the moment. His first speech as Prime Minister on May 13, 1940, was a masterclass in rallying a nation on the brink. He famously declared, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." That phrase, while undeniably stirring, wasn't just rhetoric. It was a grim promise of the trials to come. Churchill's speeches during this period are the stuff of legend. They were part Shakespearean soliloquy, part battle cry, and they struck a chord with the British public in a way few politicians could emulate. But let's be clear. While his oratory skills were superb, they were not magic spells. Churchill's words needed to be backed by action, and the reality of wartime Britain was anything but glamorous. The economy was on a war footing, with rationing and conscription becoming the norm. The British people were asked to endure hardships that make today's inconveniences look like a walk in the park. Yet through all this, Churchill's leadership gave them something invaluable: hope. Take, for instance, his speech on June 4, 1940, following the evacuation at Dunkirk. Churchill famously vowed, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds." This wasn't just a linguistic flourish. It was a statement of national resilience. Dunkirk was a tactical retreat, yes, but it was spun into a morale-boosting triumph of human spirit, a testament to Churchill's ability to turn even a setback into a stepping stone. His speeches were a masterclass in myth-making, blending harsh reality with the romance of defiance. Yet, it's crucial to remember that Churchill's wartime leadership was not without its controversies. His decision-making was often bold to the point of reckless. Take the Norwegian campaign of 1940, a fiasco that saw British forces retreat after a botched attempt to prevent Germany from securing iron ore supplies. The operation was a strategic blunder that left Churchill open to criticism, but his political acumen ensured he emerged relatively unscathed. Here was a man who understood that leadership was as much about managing perception as it was about making decisions. And let's not forget the economic realities of the time. Wartime Britain faced financial constraints that would make a modern-day CFO break into a cold sweat. The war effort was a colossal economic undertaking, with Britain spending nearly £5 billion by the end of 1945, equivalent to over £200 billion today. The United States Lend-Lease Act of 1941 was a lifeline, allowing Britain to procure vital supplies without immediate payment. It's a reminder that while Churchill was a master of words, the war was won as much by dollars and cents, or pounds and pence, as it was by speeches. As the war dragged on, Churchill's leadership was tested by a relentless barrage of challenges. The Blitz, which began in September 1940, saw London and other cities subjected to nightly aerial bombardments by the Luftwaffe. It was a time of unprecedented civilian suffering, yet the British spirit remained unbroken. Churchill himself would often visit bombed-out areas, mingling with the public and offering words of comfort. His presence was both symbolic and strategic, reinforcing his image as a leader who shared the burdens of his people. But let's not get carried away with the hero worship. For all his charisma, Churchill's leadership style was not everyone's cup of tea, or should I say, rationed coffee. He was known for his demanding nature and impatience with those he deemed incompetent. His war cabinet meetings were famously intense, with Churchill often dominating discussions with his forceful personality. Yet, for all his flaws, he surrounded himself with capable individuals who could execute his vision. It was a testament to his understanding of leadership as a team sport, even if he was the star player. Churchill's wartime tenure was punctuated by pivotal decisions that shaped the course of the conflict. One of the most significant was his insistence on maintaining Britain's alliance with the United States and the Soviet Union. This grand alliance was crucial in turning the tide against the Axis powers, and Churchill's diplomatic skills played a key role in holding this uneasy coalition together. His relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt was particularly vital, founded on mutual respect and a shared commitment to defeating fascism. Of course, the alliance with the Soviet Union was a more complex affair. Churchill famously distrusted Joseph Stalin, referring to him as that Russian bear. Yet, he recognized the strategic necessity of cooperation, even if it meant holding his nose. It was a pragmatic decision, emblematic of Churchill's ability to balance ideology with reality. His focus remained squarely on the ultimate goal, victory. As the war progressed, Churchill's leadership was increasingly challenged by the demands of a global conflict. The North African Campaign, beginning in 1940, was a prolonged struggle to control the Suez Canal and access to Middle Eastern oil supplies. It was a campaign fraught with logistical challenges and fierce fighting, but it ultimately culminated in a decisive Allied victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in 1942. Churchill hailed the victory as the end of the beginning, a phrase that captured both the significance of the moment and the long road still ahead. Churchill's strategic vision extended beyond the battlefield. He understood that the war was as much about winning hearts and minds as it was about military victories. His emphasis on morale and public support was a cornerstone of his leadership. The British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, became a vital tool in this effort, providing news and entertainment that bolstered public spirit. It was a savvy use of media that modern leaders would do well to emulate. Yet, for all his successes, Churchill was not without his blind spots. His views on colonialism and the British Empire often put him at odds with the emerging post-war realities. His steadfast belief in the empire's importance sometimes clouded his judgment, particularly in relation to India's independence movement. It was a reminder that while Churchill was a man of his time, he was not always ahead of it. As the war raged on, Churchill's health became a concern. Stress of leadership took its toll, and he suffered several bouts of pneumonia and other ailments. Yet he soldiered on, driven by a sense of duty and an unwavering belief in the righteousness of his cause. His resilience was emblematic of the British spirit, a testament to the power of leadership in times of crisis. In the end, Churchill's wartime leadership was a complex tapestry of triumph and turmoil. He was a man who understood that history is written not just by the victors, but by those who dare to dream and act boldly. His speeches, decisions, and actions were all part of a grand narrative that reshaped the world. As the war neared its conclusion, Churchill stood at the pinnacle of his influence, a leader who had navigated the darkest days of conflict with courage and conviction. But the story doesn't end here. The road to peace would present challenges of its own, and Churchill's journey was far from over. Stay tuned, dear listener, as we delve deeper into the life and legacy of this remarkable figure in the episodes to come. As the final echoes of World War II faded, Winston Churchill wasn't about to kick back with a celebratory pint and call it a day. No, our man Winston had his sights set on the post-war world order, a new geopolitical chessboard that demanded his attention. Sure, the war was over, but the peace was a whole new ball game. By 1945, Allies had emerged victorious, but the global landscape was as fractured as a jigsaw puzzle after a toddler's tantrum. Churchill, ever the statesman, was keen to play a pivotal role in piecing it back together. But first, let's address the elephant in the room, the 1945 general election. Despite leading Britain through its darkest hours, Churchill found himself ousted by a public eager for change. The Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, swept to power, leaving Churchill out in the cold. Imagine being a wartime hero one moment and a political has-been the next. It was a bitter pill for Churchill to swallow. Yet, in true bulldog spirit, he didn't retreat into obscurity. Instead, he refocused his energies on shaping the emerging world order, particularly the looming Cold War. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March 1946 at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, was a masterstroke of geopolitical theater. He warned of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe, dividing the continent into spheres of influence dominated by the West and the Soviet Union. This wasn't just rhetorical flair. It was a call to arms against the spread of communism. The speech resonated because it tapped into a growing unease about Soviet intentions, crystallizing the ideological divide that would define the Cold War era. Churchill, the man who once distrusted Stalin, now found himself a prophet of the Western alliance. Yet, while Churchill's rhetoric was on point, the economic realities of the time painted a more complex picture. Britain was financially exhausted after the war, with a national debt soaring to over 200% of GDP. The country was in desperate need of reconstruction, and the United States Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, was a lifeline. It provided $13 billion, about $140 billion today, to help rebuild war-torn Europe, including the UK. Churchill, though no longer in office, supported this initiative, understanding that economic stability was crucial in countering Soviet influence. He was a realist at heart, recognizing that ideals alone couldn't pay the bills or rebuild bombed-out cities. Even as he navigated the choppy waters of post-war politics, Churchill found solace in his pen. His literary career was nothing short of prolific, the crowning jewel being his 6-volume series, The Second World War. These tomes were more than just a recounting of events. They were a strategic narrative, crafted to cement his legacy as the man who stood firm against tyranny. Published between 1948 and 1953, the series was a commercial success, earning him the 1953 Nobel Prize in Literature. Not too shabby for a guy whose school reports read like a comedy of errors. But let's not romanticize too much. Churchill's writings, while captivating, were not without their critics. Some argued that his version of events occasionally took creative liberties, glossing over certain blunders and elevating his own role. Yet, let's be honest, who among us wouldn't tweak our own stories to shine a little brighter? In the end, his literary achievements were a testament to his command of language and his understanding of the power of narrative. He once quipped, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And write it he did, with all the flair of a man who knew that words could shape worlds. As the 1950s dawned, Churchill's political career experienced a phoenix-like resurgence. In 1951, he returned to power as Prime Minister at the age of 76, a living embodiment of never say die. Yet, the Britain he now led was a different beast. The winds of change were blowing through the empire, with colonies agitating for independence and the Suez Canal serving as a flashpoint for geopolitical tensions. Churchill's views on the empire remained staunchly old school, a relic of a bygone era, but even he couldn't stop the tide of decolonization. On the home front, Churchill faced a host of challenges, from managing a fragile economy to navigating a burgeoning welfare state. His domestic policies were often overshadowed by foreign affairs, but let's not skim over the daily grind of governance. The early 1950s saw Britain grappling with rationing and housing shortages, a stark reminder that victory in war didn't automatically translate to prosperity in peace. Churchill's second premiership was a balancing act, juggling the demands of a nation recovering from war with the realities of a shifting global landscape. Yet, despite the pressures of leadership, Churchill's later years were not without personal trials. His health was increasingly a concern, with strokes in 1949 and 1953 affecting his speech and mobility. Still, in true Churchillian fashion, he soldiered on, refusing to let a little thing like a stroke keep him down. His resilience was remarkable, but it was clear that the physical demands of leadership were taking their toll. The mantle of office, once worn with such ease, now weighed heavily upon him. As if health issues weren't enough, Churchill also faced familial challenges. His marriage to Clementine, while steadfast, was not without its strains. The pressures of political life were relentless, and their family life was often tumultuous. Their daughter, Sarah, battled alcoholism, while their son, Randolph, struggled to step out from his father's towering shadow. It was a reminder that even titans of history grapple with the same human frailties and complexities as the rest of us. Yet, through it all, Churchill remained a towering figure, his legacy as a wartime leader and statesman secure. He was a man who understood the power of both action and words, a leader whose life was a testament to resilience and ambition. As he navigated the twilight of his career, Churchill's indomitable spirit continued to inspire, even as the world he helped shape evolved in ways he could never have imagined. In 1955, Churchill finally stepped down as Prime Minister, passing the baton to Anthony Eden. It was a moment of transition, not just for Churchill, but for Britain as the nation moved forward into a new era. Yet, even in retirement, Churchill remained a symbol of defiance and strength, his influence extending far beyond the corridors of power. As the sun set on his illustrious career, Churchill's legacy was a tapestry woven from both triumphs and trials. He was a man who understood that history was not just a record of events, but a narrative shaped by those bold enough to leave their mark. His story, far from over, would continue to unfold, a testament to the enduring power of leadership and vision. Stay tuned, dear listener, as we explore the final chapters of Winston Churchill's extraordinary life in the episodes to come. As Churchill took his final bow from the political stage, his legacy was already being sculpted into that of a mythic hero. Yet, as any good historian or nosy neighbour knows, the truth is often messier than the legend. Churchill was a complex cocktail of brilliance and blunder, ambition and obstinacy, and it's this very mix that makes his story so compelling. Let's start with the Churchillian myth we all love. The image of Winston as the indomitable wartime leader is practically etched into our collective consciousness. With his bowler hat and ever-present cigar, he became the embodiment of British resilience. His speeches, "Think we shall never surrender," weren't just words. They were lifelines tossed to a nation on the edge of despair. The myth, however, glosses over the fact that Churchill was as polarizing as he was popular. His return to power in 1951 wasn't a universal celebration. It was more like Britain collectively shrugging and saying, "Why not give the old bulldog another go?" And speaking of dogs, let's debunk a few sacred cows. Churchill's wartime leadership, while iconic, was far from flawless. His strategic decisions weren't always the stuff of military textbooks. Gallipoli, anyone. Yes, that disastrous World War I campaign was his brainchild, a reminder that even titans of history sometimes trip over their own shoelaces. The Norwegian campaign in World War II was another stumble, proving that a great speech can't fix a poorly executed plan. Yet, Churchill's ability to bounce back from failure was almost supernatural, a testament to his belief that success is not final, failure is not fatal. But let's cut through the cigar smoke and look at some cold, hard numbers. During his wartime premiership, Britain was spending money like a lottery winner on a shopping spree, military expenses alone surging to £5 billion by 1945. That's more than £200 billion in today's cash, enough to make any Chancellor of the Exchequer gulp. The Lend-Lease Act from the US was a financial lifeline, but it also meant Britain's wartime survival was inextricably linked to American wallets. Churchill knew this, of course, and played the transatlantic friendship card like a pro at a high-stakes poker table. Now, let's talk about the Churchill who wasn't all about wartime speeches and daring-do. His post-war years were marked by an unyielding belief in the British Empire, even as the world was moving on from colonialism faster than you can say decolonization. Churchill's nostalgia for the Empire was charmingly outdated, like an old record player in the age of Spotify. While he clung to the past, the winds of change were sweeping across Asia and Africa, and not even Churchill's formidable charisma could quell the tide of independence movements. Economically, Britain in the 1950 was a bit of a fixer-upper. Post-war austerity meant rationing persisted, with the last of the food coupons not disappearing until 1954. Churchill's government was tasked with pulling the nation out of its economic nosedive, a challenge as daunting as his wartime leadership. While he managed to stabilize the economy somewhat, the glory days of the British Empire's economic dominance were gone, replaced by the unglamorous realities of a welfare state and a shrinking global footprint. Despite these challenges, Churchill's influence on the post-war world was profound. His Iron Curtain speech in 1946 was a clarion call that helped shape the Western response to Soviet expansionism. This speech was not just a piece of oratory brilliance, it was a strategic nudge towards NATO and the Marshall Plan, both vital cogs in the machinery of the Cold War. Churchill had an uncanny knack for seeing the bigger picture, even if he sometimes tripped over the details. No exploration of Churchill's legacy would be complete without a nod to his literary prowess. His 6-volume magnum opus on World War Roman II wasn't just a bestseller. It was a narrative tour de force that won him the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953. But let's keep it real. These books were as much about legacy crafting as they were about historical record. Churchill was acutely aware of the power of the written word, and he wielded it like a maestro conducting an orchestra. His writings were part history, part autobiography, and part self-mythologizing, an elaborate tapestry that ensured he would be remembered not just as a politician, but as an icon. Of course, the Churchill legacy isn't all roses and Nobel medals. His views on race and empire, while typical of his time, don't exactly pass today's sniff test. He once described Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion, a sentiment that hasn't aged well, to say the least. Yet, for all his flaws, and there were plenty, Churchill's life remains a masterclass in leadership, resilience, and the art of the comeback. He was a man who knew how to turn the tide in his favor, even when the odds were stacked against him. In the end, Churchill's legacy is a rich tapestry woven from both legend and harsh reality. He was a complex figure whose life defied easy categorization, a man of contradictions who could pivot from strategic genius to stubborn traditionalist in the blink of an eye. His story is a reminder that history is not just about facts and dates, but about the people who dared to shape it. Churchill once said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And write it he did, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire, challenge, and captivate us to this day. So, whether you see him as a hero, a flawed giant, or something in between, one thing's for sure: Winston Churchill was, and remains, larger than life. It's the spring of 1453, and while much of Europe is busy with its usual medieval shenanigans, feudal squabbles, plagues, and the occasional witch trial, Constantinople is about to face its final curtain call. But before the cannons roar and walls tumble, let's hit pause on the mayhem to set the stage. Picture the Byzantine Empire, a once mighty beacon of Christian might and culture, now more like the faded star of a bygone era, clutching onto its last threads of glory. A bit like that rock band from the '70s, still trying to sell out stadium tours with only one original member left. But let's not be too harsh. After all, Constantinople was no ordinary city. It was a glittering prize, a city so legendary that it made Rome look like a small-town upstart. And why wouldn't it? Sitting at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, it was the ultimate medieval mashup of East meets West. But by the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire was down to a shadow of its former self, and its capital was surrounded by a sea of enemies just waiting for the right moment to strike. Now, if you're thinking Constantinople was just waiting to be picked off like low-hanging fruit, think again. Sure, the empire was practically bankrupt, but what it lacked in cash, it made up for with its walls. The Theodosian walls, to be exact, an ancient 3-layer defense system that had been keeping invaders out since the 5th century. These fortifications were the stuff of legend, boasting walls up to 40 feet high and 15 feet thick, complete with a moat. They were so impressive that even the most seasoned military minds of the time believed them to be impenetrable. But let's be real. Calling any fortification impregnable is just tempting fate. It's like saying unsinkable about a certain ill-fated ship that met an iceberg. Now, stepping into the spotlight, we have our cast of players. On one side, there's Sultan maimed Roman II of the Ottoman Empire, a 21-year-old with a point to prove and a serious case of ambition. Known as Maimed the Conqueror, he wasn't just some young upstart with a crown. He was a strategic genius, and a man obsessed with taking the city that had eluded his predecessors. He had a point to make, and what better way to do it than by snatching one of the greatest cities of the age. Opposing him was the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Roman XI Palaiologos, a ruler with a name that practically screamed Roman pedigree, but whose realm was a far cry from the glory days of the Caesars. Constantine Roman XI was a man of principle and courage, trying to hold together an empire that was more patchwork quilt than cohesive kingdom. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and truth be told out of options. But he had the heart of a lion and an unyielding belief in the city's storied defenses. Economically, the Byzantine Empire was in dire straits. By this point, the empire's coffers were as empty as a monk's wine cellar during Lent. Years of war, bad trade policies, and a shrinking tax base had left the treasury drier than a Byzantine desert. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were minting money faster than they could spend it, thanks to their lucrative control over the trade routes between Asia and Europe. Maimed had the resources to bankroll a siege, while Constantine was left to scrounge for mercenaries and handouts from Western Europe, a part of the world that was mostly practicing its best, not my problem shrug. And let's address the romantic myth of Constantinople as the last bastion of classical civilization. Sure, it housed magnificent churches, libraries, an impressive collection of relics. But by 1453, much of its luster was faded. The once bustling markets were quieter, the great university had seen better days, and the streets were more familiar with the sound of desperation than the clatter of commerce. The city was a relic of its own, a museum of past glories trying to stay relevant in a world that had moved on. The stage was set for a showdown of epic proportions. The Byzantine Empire, clinging to its past and hoping for a miracle, against the Ottoman powerhouse, eager to cement its place in history. It was a classic case of David versus Goliath, but with a twist. This time, Goliath was armed with cannons, and not just any cannons, massive, wall-smashing monsters that would redefine siege warfare. In the lead-up to the siege, diplomatic games were being played with the finesse of a medieval chess match. Constantine Roman XI sent envoys to Western Europe, appealing for aid from the Pope, the Doges of Venice and Genoa, and anyone else who might be willing to throw a lifeline. But Europe was busy with its own dramas, and support was minimal at best. Meanwhile, Maimed was busy amassing an army that would make the most seasoned Byzantine general break into a sweat. Reports suggest he gathered between 80,000 and 100,000 troops, a multinational force ready to do his bidding. It's worth noting that calling these numbers conservative is like calling the Black Plague a bit of a bother. As the Ottomans prepared for the siege, they brought with them the latest in military technology, gunpowder. Enter Orban, a Hungarian engineer with a flair for the dramatic, who promised Maimed a cannon that could blast through the Theodosian walls like a hot knife through Byzantine butter. This was no ordinary cannon. It was a behemoth capable of hurling massive stone balls weighing up to 200 pounds over a mile. And if you're wondering what kind of sound that makes, it's the kind that would make even the most stoic Byzantine tremble in their boots. In the weeks leading up to the siege, Maimed's forces encircled Constantinople, cutting off supply lines and isolating the city. It was a classic siege tactic, and the Byzantines knew it all too well. Inside the city, morale was a mixed bag of stoic resolve and sheer desperation. Constantine Roman XI rallied his forces, which numbered around 7,000 defenders, hardly an army by any standard, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in determination. The city's defenders were a motley crew of Byzantines, Venetians, and Genoese, soldiers, sailors, and civilians with everything to lose. They patched up walls, reinforced gates, and prepared for the onslaught. But despite their efforts, they were painfully aware that the odds were not in their favor. As one contemporary chronicler noted, it was as if the city was a woman long widowed, now awaiting her final suitor. And so, with all the pieces in place, and the tension as thick as a Byzantine stew, the stage was set for one of history's most dramatic sieges. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just the end of an era, it was the dawn of a new one, a seismic shift that would change the course of history forever. But before we get to the dramatic climax, let's take a moment to appreciate the intricate dance of politics, economics, and sheer human will that led up to this moment. Stay tuned, because the story of Constantinople's final days is just getting started. Now, as the clock ticked toward one of history's most epic showdowns, let's talk about the heavy metal that made it all possible. We've got Sultan Maimed Roman II, a young gun with a penchant for pyrotechnics, and boy, did he bring the fireworks. Meet the star of our show, the Ottoman cannon, or as I like to call it, the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster special effect. This wasn't just any cannon, it was the 15th century version of a superweapon, and it had all the subtlety of a rock concert in a library. Crafted by Orban, the Hungarian engineer who clearly had a flair for the dramatic, this cannon was a behemoth. Picture a massive barrel over 27 feet long, capable of flinging stone balls the size of a small car. Weighing in at a jaw-dropping 200 pounds per shot, these projectiles weren't just large, they were meant to make an impression. If you're wondering how loud this thing was, think of it as the medieval equivalent of a sonic boom, sending shockwaves of terror through the heart of Constantinople. Now, you might be thinking, how in the world did they move such a monstrosity? Good question. The logistics of moving armies in 1453 were nothing short of a logistical nightmare. It was like trying to organize a rock tour with elephants instead of roadies. We're talking about a cast of thousands, literally. To transport the cannon from its birthplace of Edirne to the gates of Constantinople, Maime's forces employed hundreds of oxen and men, paving the way with sweat, and probably a few choice swear words in various languages. Once in position, this colossal gun didn't just announce its presence, it made sure everyone was paying attention. Firing these cannons was no small feat, either. It took hours to load and aim, requiring precise calculations and a small army of handlers. And the cost? Let's just say this wasn't your average backyard fireworks show. Each shot was akin to burning through the Ottoman treasury faster than a sultan could say, "We're gonna need more gunpowder." But the cannon wasn't the only cutting-edge technology to make an appearance at this party. Enter gunpowder, a relatively new player on the medieval battlefield, and a game-changer. It was the disruptive tech of the 15th century, and its arrival was as explosive as you'd imagine. This wasn't just about big bangs, it was about changing the rules of warfare. For the Byzantines, it was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, only the gun was 100 feet long and could level buildings. The Ottoman army itself was a marvel of organization and diversity. Picture a multinational force, a veritable United Nations of the medieval world. Maimed had gathered troops from across his empire, drawing on the best of his provinces. Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army, were the Sultan's personal strike force, trained from a young age to be the best of the best. These guys weren't just soldiers, they were the medieval equivalent of Navy SEAL, and they were ready to storm the walls of Constantinople with ruthless precision. And let's not forget about the navy. Maimed wasn't content with just besieging the city from the land. He wanted to tighten the noose from all sides. The Ottoman fleet was vast, and it effectively blockaded the city, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. This was siege warfare at its finest, and for the Byzantines, it was like being slowly squeezed by a giant, inescapable vise. Inside the city, things were looking bleak. The Byzantine defenders were outnumbered and outgunned, and the psychological pressure was immense. Every boom of the cannon was a reminder of the impending doom. But despite the odds, they held on, fueled by a mixture of desperation and a stubborn belief in the city's legendary walls. It's worth noting here that the Theodosian walls, once considered impregnable, were facing their toughest test yet. They had withstood countless sieges over the centuries, but they had never faced anything like this. The cannonballs crashed into the walls with relentless fury, each impact chipping away at the city's defenses and morale. It was as if the very stones were crying out, "Enough already." Yet, even amid the chaos, there was an ironic twist. The very technology that was being used to batter the walls of Constantinople had roots in the East, where Chinese inventors had first harnessed the power of gunpowder centuries earlier. It was a reminder that the world was changing, and the fall of Constantinople was as much about the dawn of a new era as it was about the end of an old one. As the siege wore on, the Ottomans demonstrated not just superior firepower, but also strategic ingenuity. They threw everything at the city, including the proverbial kitchen sink. Night assaults, tunneling under the walls, psychological warfare. Maimed was relentless. He wasn't just playing to win, he was playing to make a statement. The Byzantines, on the other hand, were holding on by their fingertips. Constantine Roman XI, the last emperor of Byzantium, was a leader who refused to go quietly into the night. His determination was legendary, and his bravery in the face of overwhelming odds was a testament to the indomitable human spirit. But valiant as they were, the defenders were facing a force that was not only larger and better equipped, but also more determined than any they had faced before. And so the stage was set for the final act of this monumental drama. The siege of Constantinople wasn't just a battle between two armies. It was a clash of eras, a turning point in history where the old world met the new. As the cannons roared and the walls trembled, the fate of a civilization hung in the balance. And while the outcome might seem inevitable with the benefit of hindsight, at the time, every day was a struggle, every moment a gamble. Stay tuned, because the fall of Constantinople is about to reach its crescendo. The cannons may have done their part, but the human stories of courage, desperation, and defiance are just as compelling. In the end, it's not just about walls falling and empires crumbling. It's about a world on the cusp of transformation, where the seeds of the modern age were being sown amidst the rubble of the past. As the dust settled and the echoes of cannon fire faded momentarily, one thing was clear. The siege of Constantinople was like a high-stakes chess game with cannonballs as pawns and the fate of an empire hanging in the balance. Sultan maimed Roman II, that savvy 21-year-old with a vision, was pulling no punches. He was determined to be the grandmaster of this medieval board, and his tactics were as diverse as they were ruthless. Let's zoom in on the day-to-day grit of the siege, shall we? For starters, life in Constantinople was no Renaissance fairy tale. Picture cramped quarters, dwindling provisions, and the constant thud of artillery, a symphony of chaos that played on repeat. For the defenders, every morning began with a prayer and a grim determination to hold the line. Their numbers were pitifully small, roughly 7,000 against an Ottoman force that could populate a small city. It was a classic underdog scenario, minus the Hollywood gloss. Inside the city, the atmosphere was tense enough to slice with a Byzantine dagger. Citizens, soldiers, and clergy alike banded together in a desperate attempt to shore up defenses. Women and children worked alongside men, hauling stones and repairing breaches as fast as they were made. This was a community clinging to survival, and heroism came not from grand gestures, but from the mundane acts of endurance. Romanticize that if you will, but know that for every tale of valor, there was a quiet act of courage often overlooked. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Maime's forces were a flurry of activity. Siege warfare was an all-hands-on-deck affair, and the Ottomans brought their A-game. Engineers and sappers worked tirelessly, digging tunnels in an attempt to undermine the walls, a strategy as old as time and as dirty as the trenches they dug. This was the kind of grunt work that never makes it into the history books, but was crucial to the Ottoman strategy. And then there were the Janissaries, Maime's personal shark troops, waiting for their moment to shine. These were not your average soldiers. They were elite warriors, handpicked and rigorously trained. They were the special ops of the 15th century, ready to execute the Sultan's orders with precision and discipline. For them, the siege was not just a military campaign, but a test of their mettle. But let's not forget the impact of morale on both sides. For the Byzantines, each day was a battle against not just the Ottomans, but despair itself. As the siege dragged on, the city's spirit was both its greatest weapon and its Achilles' heel. Stories circulated of miracles and divine intervention, the kind of tales that offer hope when logic offers none. And while these stories might have been comforting, they were hardly a match for the cold, hard reality of Ottoman firepower. On the Ottoman side, morale was buoyed by the promise of victory and the Sultan's unwavering vision. Maim knew that taking Constantinople would not only elevate his status, but also solidify the Ottoman Empire as a dominant power. He played the long game, employing psychological warfare to break the spirit of his enemies, a reminder that the battlefield is as much about the mind as it is about the sword. Now, let's tackle some myths head-on, shall we? The siege of Constantinople is often romanticized as a noble last stand, a tale of chivalry and honor. But the truth is, war is rarely so clean-cut. The defenders were not all valiant knights in shining armor. Many were mercenaries, paid to fight in a war that wasn't theirs. And the Ottomans, they weren't just relentless invaders. They were a disciplined force, executing a meticulously planned campaign. Both sides were driven by necessity, survival, and the harsh calculus of power. Economically, the siege was a drain on resources for both camps. The Byzantines, already strapped for cash, were stretched thinner than parchment. Supplies dwindled faster than a merchant's patience, and the city's economy was on life support. In contrast, Maime's war chest was robust, but even the richest coffers have limits. Financing a siege was an expensive business, with the cost of gunpowder, pay for soldiers, and upkeep of artillery eating away at the Ottoman treasury. Despite the odds, the Byzantine defenders held out for weeks, their determination fueled by the belief in their walls and their faith. Constantine Roman XI, the last emperor, was a figure of tragic resolve. He knew the end was near but refused to flee, a decision that would seal his fate and elevate him to a near-mythic status in history. For Constantine, surrender was not an option. He chose to fight to the bitter end, embodying the spirit of a city that refused to die quietly. As the siege wore on, the human stories emerged in stark relief. The courage of ordinary citizens who risked their lives to protect their homes, the desperation of families torn apart by war, and the small acts of kindness that offered a glimmer of humanity amidst the horror. These were the stories that didn't make it into the grand narratives, but were no less significant. And so, the siege of Constantinople continued, a relentless clash of wills and might. The city's fate hung in the balance, and every day was a new chapter in this epic saga. As the cannons thundered and the walls trembled, the Byzantine defenders braced for the final act. They were fighting not just for survival, but for a legacy, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit can shine brightly. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. The siege of Constantinople is a testament to resilience and determination, a moment where history pivoted on the actions of a few. As we delve deeper into this dramatic showdown, the lessons of the past continue to resonate, offering insight into the complexities of human nature and the timeless struggle for power and survival. The siege was a pressure cooker, and it was about to blow its lid in a way that would make any medieval chronicler reach for their quill in disbelief. Sultan maimed Roman II wasn't just sitting on his laurels, admiring those mighty cannons. No, he was orchestrating a full-blown finale, the kind that legends are made of. As the final assault loomed, the air was thick with anticipation, and probably the smell of fear mixed with gunpowder. The Ottomans were ready to make their move, and this was no dress rehearsal. On May 29, 1453, the Ottomans launched the attack that would go down in history. Picture this: waves of soldiers crashing against the walls of Constantinople, a relentless human tide that seemed to defy the very concept of exhaustion. Maimed had pulled together an army estimated at 100,000 strong, a number that would make even the most battle-hardened Byzantine gulp. This was more than just a military operation. It was a statement of intent, a declaration that the days of Byzantine glory were numbered. The attack began in the early hours, under the cover of darkness. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Ottomans wanted to catch the defenders off guard and hit them where it hurt, their morale. Loud drums and the blaring of horns echoed across the battlefield, a cacophony designed to unsettle and intimidate. You could almost imagine the defenders muttering under their breath, "Here we go again," as they scrambled to their posts. And then it happened, the moment that would change the course of history. The Ottomans breached the walls. It wasn't just brute force that got them through. It was a combination of relentless pressure and strategic cunning. Maimed had his men focus on the weakest points, exploiting every crack and crevice in the city's defenses. When the walls finally gave way, it was less like a dramatic explosion and more like an old dam finally succumbing to the inevitable, slow, steady, and utterly unstoppable. Inside the city, chaos reigned supreme. The defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, were fighting a losing battle, but they refused to go down without a fight. Constantine Roman XI, the last emperor, donned his armor and joined his men in the fray. It was a move worthy of a hero's ballad, except this wasn't a fairy tale, and there was no happy ending. Constantine disappeared in the melee, his fate sealed on the blood-soaked streets of his beloved city. The last emperor of Byzantium went down as he lived, defiant to the end. For the civilians of Constantinople, the fall of the city was nothing short of apocalyptic. Imagine the pandemonium. Families torn apart, homes ransacked, lives forever altered in a matter of hours. Women and children sought refuge in churches, hoping for divine intervention that never came. The famed Hagia Sophia, once a symbol of Byzantine grandeur, became a refuge, only to be turned into a scene of desperation and tragedy. It was a harsh reminder that in war, sacred spaces offer little sanctuary from the ravages of human ambition. The aftermath of the breach was as brutal as it was swift. Maimed forces poured into the city, and the sack of Constantinople began. This was no genteel occupation. It was a free-for-all, a chaotic scramble for spoils that would make any self-respecting pirate blush. Looting was rampant, and the city's treasures were plundered with abandon. Artifacts, icons, and relics, items that had once been the pride of Byzantium, were carted away or destroyed, victims of a new world order that cared little for the past. But let's dispel some myths while we're here. The fall of Constantinople is often portrayed as a clean-cut victory for maimed, a seamless transition from one empire to another. The reality, it was messy, brutal, and far from orderly. The Ottomans, for all their military prowess, faced the logistical nightmare of securing a city in chaos. Establishing control was no small feat, and it required more than just force. It demanded diplomacy and a keen understanding of the city's complex social fabric. Economically, the fall of Constantinople was a seismic shift. For centuries, the city had been a linchpin of trade, a bustling hub that connected east and west. With its fall, the balance of power in the region was irrevocably altered. The Ottomans now controlled the Bosporus Strait, a strategic choke point that gave them unparalleled influence over trade routes. This was not just a military victory, it was an economic coup, one that would have far-reaching implications for the future of both Europe and Asia. The vanquished Byzantines faced a grim new reality. Those who survived the initial onslaught found themselves subjects of a new regime, their lives forever changed. For many, it was a bitter pill to swallow, a harsh reminder that empires rise and fall, and history rarely pauses for sentiment. The Byzantine Empire, once a beacon of culture and power, was reduced to a memory, its legacy scattered like the dust of its fallen walls. As for Sultan maimed Roman II, the conquest was both a personal and political triumph. He earned his title, the Conqueror, and in doing so, cemented his place in the annals of history. But victory came with its own set of challenges. Ruling a newly conquered city required more than military might. It demanded vision and adaptability. Maimed embarked on a mission to rebuild and repopulate Constantinople, transforming it into a vibrant Ottoman capital. It was a task that would take years, but one that underscored his ambition to not just conquer, but to create. And so, the fall of Constantinople marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was a moment of profound change, a turning point that would shape the course of history in ways both seen and unseen. For the people who lived through it, it was an experience that defied easy categorization, part tragedy, part triumph, and entirely transformative. As the dust settled and the city began its slow transformation, the world watched and waited to see what this new chapter would bring. Stay with us, because the story of Constantinople's fall is far from over. We've seen the dramatic breach and the immediate chaos, but the ripples of this historic moment are just beginning to spread. The world was on the brink of a new era, and the lessons of the past were about to collide with the possibilities of the future. History, as always, was in the making, and the implications of this seismic event would resonate far beyond the crumbling walls of a once great city. With the dust of Constantinople's fall barely settled, the world found itself staring into a new abyss of possibilities and perils, a bit like opening Pandora's box, only this time the contents included gunpowder and geopolitics. The city's capture wasn't just a military coup, it was the equivalent of slamming the door on the medieval era and cracking open a window to the modern age. And boy, did that window offer a view. First and foremost, let's talk trade, the lifeblood of empires and the silent shaper of destinies. For centuries, Constantinople had been the glittering jewel in the necklace of the Silk Road, a bustling hub where spices, silks, and savvy merchants crossed paths like characters in a medieval sitcom. But with the Ottomans now holding the keys to this crossroads, the old trade routes were about as appealing as a one-star inn on Yelp. Europe, not one to sit idle, started looking for new ways to fill its coffers. Cue the age of exploration. The fall of Constantinople was like a cosmic jolt that sent European powers scurrying to the seas, desperate for new routes to Asia. You could almost hear the collective gasp of Western Europe as it realized the days of leisurely trading through the Bosporus were over. Enter Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, the poster boys of maritime ambition, setting sail to find alternate paths to those oh-so-coveted eastern riches. And let's not gloss over the cultural ripples. Exodus of Greek scholars fleeing the city's demise carried with them armfuls of ancient manuscripts and a treasure trove of Byzantine knowledge, an intellectual care package that would help kickstart the Renaissance. Imagine the streets of Florence and Venice suddenly buzzing with excitement as dusty Greek texts breathed new life into European thought. It was as if the fall of Constantinople had shattered a dam, sending a flood of classical learning cascading across the continent. The irony, the seeds of the Renaissance, often hailed as a European rebirth, were partly sown by the collapse of the very empire that had long preserved this ancient wisdom. Politically, the Ottomans' newfound dominance sent shockwaves through European courts. The power dynamics had shifted, and everyone from popes to princes was scrambling to recalibrate their strategies. For the European powers, the Ottomans weren't just another rival. They were the new superpower on the block, and their ambitions stretched far beyond the Bosporus. Maimed Roman II, now securely ensconced in his new capital, had his eyes set on further expansion, eyeing the heartlands of Europe with a mix of curiosity and conquest. The fall of Constantinople also marked a significant turning point for the Islamic world. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a cultural and religious milestone, symbolizing the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a dominant Islamic power. The conversion of Hagia Sophia from a cathedral to a mosque was emblematic of this transformation, a powerful symbol of the shift in cultural hegemony. For the Ottomans, this wasn't just about territory. It was about establishing a legacy, a bulwark of Islamic civilization that would endure for centuries. But let's not romanticize this as a seamless transition. The reality was far more complex and, frankly, chaotic. The Ottomans faced the Herculean task of integrating a diverse populace into their empire, a bit like trying to herd cats, only these cats spoke different languages and had centuries of history behind them. Mehmed's vision for Constantinople involved not just rebuilding its physical structure, but also its social fabric. He solicited settlers from across his empire, offering incentives to those willing to relocate. It was urban renewal on a grand scale, a medieval melting pot designed to breathe new life into a city that had been both a symbol of grandeur and a relic of its own glory days. And speaking of myths, let's address the notion of Constantinople's fall as the definitive end of an era. It's a narrative that's as catchy as a pop song chorus, but reality, as always, is more nuanced. Sure, the Byzantine Empire as a political entity was no more, but its cultural and religious influences lingered like the aftertaste of a strong Byzantine wine. The Orthodox Church, for instance, remained a potent force, adapting and surviving under Ottoman rule. Meanwhile, Byzantine art, architecture, and scholarship continued to inspire and evolve, leaving an indelible mark on both Eastern and Western cultures. For the people who lived through this seismic shift, the fall of Constantinople was both a cataclysm and a catalyst. It was a harsh reminder that empires rise and fall, but human resilience endures. The city, once a beacon of Christian civilization, was now a cornerstone of an Islamic empire, an evolution that was both radical and inevitable. Yet, amidst the upheaval, life went on. The streets of Constantinople echoed with new languages and customs, its markets buzzed with fresh activity, and its walls, though battered, stood as witnesses to a world in flux. Fast forward to modern times, and the legacy of Constantinople's fall continues to resonate. The city, now Istanbul, remains a vibrant testament to the confluence of cultures and histories. It's a living museum where East meets West, a place where the echoes of the past mingle with the hum of the present. The fall of Constantinople may have been a turning point, but it was also a reminder that history is not a series of clean breaks, but a tapestry of interwoven threads. In the grand scheme of things, the fall of Constantinople was both an ending and a beginning, a moment where the past collided with the future, setting the stage for a new world order. It was a tale of ambition and survival, of empires and individuals navigating the turbulent waters of change. And while the city's fall marked the end of the Byzantine Empire's millennium-long reign, it also heralded the rise of new powers and possibilities. So there you have it, the fall of Constantinople, a saga of epic proportions filled with drama, intrigue, and transformation. It was a moment that reshaped the world, a reminder that history is a living, breathing entity, constantly evolving, always surprising, and never quite what it seems. As you tuck this story away in your mental library, remember that the echoes of the past are never far from the present, and the lessons of history are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop seeking the stories that have shaped our world.